17 rusted vehicles, a number scrawled on a cardboard sign, and one quiet man raising his hand while the crowd laughed out loud. When Evelyn Mercer, CEO of Heartstone Motors, worth more than most small countries, pointed at the corroded heap and called it garbage money well wasted, she was speaking for everyone in that auction yard. Nobody argues with a woman like that. Nobody except the man who just bought what she dismissed. His name was Nolan Pierce. He didn't flinch, didn't smile, just pulled out a certified check for $2,500 and started loading rust. If you've ever been counted out before you even got started, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction was held on a Tuesday, which felt about right for the kind of event nobody planned to remember. It was out past the edge of Mill Haven, down a county road that turned to gravel about a mile before you reached the property. An old salvage operation that had finally given up the ghost after 43 years of accumulated automotive history. The owner, a man named Decker, who had spent those decades buying broken things and never quite getting around to fixing them, had died in March without a will and without an heir who wanted anything to do with 12 acres of organized chaos. His nephew, a corporate attorney from Phoenix who visited maybe twice in his life, had hired an auction house to liquidate everything and wire him a check, which was how roughly 200 people ended up standing in the mud on a gray October morning, bidding on socket wrench sets and shop heaters and industrial shelving units while they waited for the main event. The main event, at least according to the auctioneer's printed catalog, was Lot 47 C1717. Assorted vintage automobiles, mixed condition, sold, as is, no warranty expressed or implied. Nobody in the crowd had gone home and done research on Lot 47C. Most of them had walked through the row of vehicles when the gates opened at 8, taken one look at the condition, and moved on. What they saw was decay. A 67 Chevelle with the floorboards eaten through. A Buick Riviera with no engine and a driver's door sealed shut by 30 years of rust. A pair of early 70s Ford Mustangs that looked like someone had parked them underwater and forgotten about them. A Lincoln Continental with all 4 tires flat and a bird's nest in the dashboard. And so on, down 17 variations on the same theme of neglect and oxidation and time. The consensus, formed quickly and held firmly, was that Lot 47C was a money pit. Whatever these things might have been, they were gone now. Scrap value at best. Evelyn Mercer had arrived at 9:15 in a black Escalade that parked close enough to the entrance gate that people had to walk around it. She was 51 years old, ran Heartstone Motors out of their regional headquarters in downtown Mill Haven, and had a public profile that local business journalists described with words like formidable and decisive and occasionally difficult, depending on how much they needed access next quarter. She wore a charcoal blazer over dark jeans and moved through the auction grounds with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided in advance that this was going to take exactly as long as she chose to allow it. Her assistant, a young man named Derek, who perpetually looked like he was waiting for bad news, trailed 2 steps behind her with a tablet and a thermos of coffee. She was here for one specific item from the estate, a set of original blueprints and engineering documents cataloged under Lot 22, belonging to a prototype development project that Decker had somehow acquired decades ago. Acquisition circumstances that were, to put it diplomatically, murky. Those documents had value, real value, the kind that her legal team had been quietly losing sleep over for the better part of 8 months. She got what she came for. Lot 22 went to Heartstone for $14,000, which was more than the auctioneer expected and less than Evelyn had been authorized to spend. Derek quietly updated his spreadsheet. She should have left then. That had been the plan. But she was walking back toward the Escalade when the auctioneer moved on to Lot 47C, and something made her stop. Maybe it was the way the crowd thinned and shifted, half of them stepping back from the row of vehicles with the unconscious body language of people who had already decided not to be involved. Maybe it was just the particular cast of the morning light on 17 different species of rust. Whatever it was, she stopped and she watched. The bidding started at $500. It stayed there for almost a full minute, which in an auction setting is a geological age. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Gordy, who had been doing this for 22 years and had developed a sixth sense for crowd energy, tried everything in his repertoire. He dropped the price. He joked about scrap value. He pointed out that one of the Mustangs had its original trim. The crowd was politely unmoved. Then a hand went up. The man was standing near the back of the loose semicircle that had formed around the vehicles. He was somewhere in his early 40s, medium height, wearing a canvas jacket over a gray thermal shirt and work boots that had been resoled at least once. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. Not rough in a performed way, but worn at the edges. The kind of hands you got from years of contact with metal and oil and the inside of things. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that didn't advertise its thoughts, and the quiet, unhurried posture of someone who had decided something and was done deciding it. He raised his hand for $500, then $750, then $1,000 when a second bidder briefly entered the picture, apparently on a whim, before dropping out again at the sight of the vehicles in full daylight. The man with the work boots went to $1,500 without being asked, then $2,000. Then, when Gordy asked with visible surprise if anyone wanted to counter, $2,500. Nobody countered. The gavel came down. "That's Nolan Pierce," someone near Evelyn said. She didn't know who spoke. She looked at the man as he made his way toward the registration table with the same absence of hurry he'd had from the beginning. "He's got a restoration shop," the voice continued. It was a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket talking to the woman beside him rather than to Evelyn, using the tone of someone confirming what they already knew. "Small place out on Ridgeline Road. Used to belong to his father." Evelyn watched Nolan Pierce sign the paperwork. He wrote his check without checking his phone or calculating anything, which meant he'd already done the math and he was fine with it. She walked over. She would say later, when she replayed the exchange in her memory, that she hadn't intended to be unkind, that it was simply an observation, stated plainly, the kind of assessment she made about investments and assets every day, that she had simply been speaking the truth as she understood it. "Excuse me," she said. Nolan looked up from the registration table. "I hope you got a good deal on the scrap metal because that's all you bought." He looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he looked back at the paperwork. "Nolan Pierce," he said, apparently to the auction clerk, confirming the spelling. Evelyn continued because she had started and she was not in the habit of stopping. "I had my people assess those vehicles when the estate first came on the market. 3 separate appraisers. They were unanimous. There's nothing there worth more than the weight of the steel. You just paid $2,500 for a rust collection." A few people nearby had drifted into earshot. Derek was standing 4 feet behind her, not updating his spreadsheet. Nolan Pierce capped his pen, folded his copy of the receipt, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket. Then he looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite nothing. "I appreciate the concern," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that came from someone who didn't use it to fill silence. Then he picked up his paperwork and walked toward the row of vehicles. Evelyn stared after him for a moment. Then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Throwing good money after bad," she said, mostly to Derek. Derek said nothing. He was already on his phone. Nolan had driven out that morning in his truck, a 1998 F250, with a flatbed that had been modified by his father and modified again by him, carrying a borrowed car trailer and a tow dolly. He'd known he would need the trailer. He'd known, specifically, because he had spent the week before the auction doing something that Evelyn Mercer's 3 appraisers apparently had not. Research. He'd read through the estate inventory 4 times. He'd cross-referenced every vehicle's partial VIN against production records. He'd spent 3 evenings on the phone with 2 of the half-dozen people in the country who knew more about certain specific manufacturing periods than almost anyone living, both of whom had gotten increasingly animated as the conversation progressed, and who had confirmed what Nolan had suspected with a certainty that bordered on reverence. What the appraisers saw was surface. What Nolan saw was beneath the surface. He spent the rest of that Tuesday and most of Wednesday arranging transport. It took 4 trips and a favor called in from a neighbor with a second trailer. But by Thursday morning, all 17 vehicles were in the lot behind his shop on Ridgeline Road, arranged in 2 rows under the corrugated metal roof of the outdoor storage shed he'd built with his father the summer before his father's hands got bad enough to make that kind of work difficult. The shop itself was not impressive by any objective measure. It occupied a converted machine shed set back from the road on 2 acres of gravel and scrub grass, the kind of property that read as modest verging on marginal to anyone who drove past it. The main building was maybe 2,000 square feet, with a concrete floor that Nolan had ground and sealed himself in a lift that his father had bought secondhand in 1991, and that Nolan had rebuilt 3 times since. One wall was floor-to-ceiling pegboard with tools organized in the particular system that his father had established, and that Nolan had maintained without deciding to. It had simply never occurred to him to change it. The lighting was good, better than it looked from outside. His father had always said you couldn't do precise work in bad light, and Nolan had never found a reason to disagree. He'd been working out of this shop for 19 years. His father had worked out of it for 21 before that. 40 years of mechanical work in a building that the county assessor had valued at less than the cost of a modest used car. He started with the Chevelle. Not because it was the most valuable, it wasn't, not by a distance, but because it was familiar. He'd grown up watching his father restore a '67 Chevelle, a different car but the same bones, and he knew its language the way some people knew the geography of their own house in the dark. He knew where the problems would be. He knew what he was looking for before he found it. He spent the first day just documenting every rusted seam, every compromised panel, every mechanical component that needed assessment before anything else could proceed. He shot 240 photographs and made handwritten notes in the yellow legal pad he used for every project, the same brand his father had used, bought in bulk from the same office supply store in town. The notes were technical and dense, and would have been incomprehensible to anyone outside of the specific tradition of knowledge that Nolan had spent most of his adult life inside. At the end of the first day, he sat on an overturned crate in the doorway of the shed and drank coffee from a thermos and looked at the 17 vehicles in their rows. His father had died 14 months ago. Cardiac event, which was what the doctor had called it, and which Nolan supposed was technically accurate and also somehow insufficient, as if the organ failure of a man who had spent 50 years pouring himself into everything he believed in could be adequately described as a mechanical malfunction. They had not always been easy together, he and his father. The work had been easier than the conversation, but the work had been very good. He thought about what his father would have said about the row of vehicles in front of him. He knew, actually. He didn't have to guess. He could hear it clearly enough that it was almost not like remembering. You see what they can be. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. Nolan finished his coffee, rinsed the thermos in the shop sink, and went home. Mishikam. He'd been working on the Chevelle for 11 days when Marcus Webb showed up. Marcus was 63, retired from a career in automotive journalism that had taken him to Pebble Beach and Goodwood and the Amelia Island concours and every serious collector auction on the East Coast for 30 years. He lived 20 minutes outside Millhaven now, in the semi-retirement that he described as voluntary and that his wife described as involuntary, and he had a habit of driving the county roads on weekday afternoons and stopping at shops when something caught his eye. What caught his eye on this particular afternoon was the rear quarter of a 1969 Camaro Z 28 sitting in Nolan's outdoor storage area, partially covered by a canvas tarp that the wind had shifted. He pulled into the gravel drive and sat in his car for a moment, looking. Then he got out. Nolan heard the car on the gravel and came out of the main shed, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He didn't recognize the man. He nodded, which was his version of a greeting for people he didn't know. "Is that a Z/28? Marcus said. He was already walking toward the storage area, not quite asking permission, but with enough awareness that he paused when he was still 10 feet out and looked at Nolan. "It is," Nolan said. "Mind if I—" "Go ahead." Marcus pulled the tarp back from the rear of the Camaro and crouched down. He stayed crouched for a long time. He moved to the driver's side and opened the door, which required some effort, and looked inside. He stood up and looked at the VIN plate and got his phone out and looked something up. Then he stood back and looked at the car as a whole with the expression of someone who had just been told something they were not entirely prepared to hear. "This is a numbers-matching Z/28, he said. "Yes." "The DZ302 is still in there." As far as I can determine, I haven't pulled it yet. Marcus looked at him. Where did you get this? Estate auction, about 2 weeks ago. The Decker estate? Yes. Marcus stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then, there were 17 vehicles in that lot. There were. I heard about that auction. There was someone who looked at that lot before the sale. Said there was nothing worth buying. Nolan said nothing. What else is here? Marcus said. I'd rather not get into specifics right now. I'm still in the assessment phase. Marcus looked at him steadily. He had the eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades evaluating claims made about old cars. Alert, experienced, not easily moved. My name is Marcus Webb, he said. I wrote for Automobile Quarterly for 27 years. I know who you are, Nolan said. My father had most of your issues. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Who was your father? Ray Pierce. This was his shop. The name landed. Nolan could see it land. Marcus looked around the shop with different eyes for a moment. At the building, at the tooling visible through the open door, at the organized storage that spoke of a specific kind of discipline. Ray Pierce's son, Marcus said quietly. Then, I reviewed a Mustang Fastback he restored in 2009. Best restoration I'd seen up to that point. He paused. I was sorry to hear he passed. Thank you. They stood for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have arrived at a point of mutual respect without quite expecting to. I'm not here to buy anything, Marcus said finally. I'd just like to know, when you're finished with the Chevelle, would you consider letting me see it? I'll call you, Nolan said. He finished the Chevelle 7 weeks later. It had been more complicated than he'd anticipated, which was always true of these things, and which never quite stopped surprising him. The passenger side rocker was worse than it looked. 2 of the floor pans had to be completely fabricated, which he did himself, working from measurements and period reference material because he didn't trust sourced replacements for this level of work. The engine, a 396 cubic inch big block matching numbers, which was what had made him certain from the auction photos that this was not what it appeared to be, had been seized, which was expected, and had a cracked second cylinder wall, which was not expected and cost him 3 additional weeks of careful machining. He did not rush it. His father had had a saying about rushing restoration work that Nolan had found irritating as a young man learning the trade, mostly because it was delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had arrived at truth through extensive experience with the alternative. The car will tell you how long it takes. Your job is to listen. Nolan listened. He worked 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. He documented everything. He sourced correct date components through the network of contacts he'd been building for 15 years, calling in favors, trading information, occasionally paying more than the market would suggest was necessary because the alternative was using something incorrect, and he was not going to use something incorrect. When it was done, he drove it. That was something his father had taught him that no book covered and no instruction could quite capture. You had to drive them. Not a test drive in the parking lot, not a careful circuit around the block. You drove them. You felt what the car felt like when it was right. It was not mystical. It was mechanical. But it was also not entirely reducible to data. The Chevelle felt right. Marcus Webb came on a Saturday morning. He arrived with 2 other men, one a serious collector from the eastern part of the state, the other a restoration specialist from Cincinnati who had a reputation that Nolan was familiar with. The Cincinnati man's name was Douglas, and he walked around the Chevelle 3 times without speaking before he crouched next to the rear axle and spent 4 minutes examining something. Then he stood up. This is extraordinary work, Douglas said. He said it in the precise tone of someone who does not use that phrase casually. Marcus walked around to the driver's side and looked in through the window. What's your ask? $62,000, Nolan said. There was a pause. Marcus looked at the collector. The collector looked at the Chevelle. I'll take it, the collector said. Nolan had not been shocked by numbers in a long time. He'd done this work long enough to know what correctly restored matching numbers muscle cars were worth in the right rooms with the right buyers. But $62,000 was more than he had made in the previous 2 years combined. He kept his face neutral and shook the man's hand. When they had gone, he stood in the empty space where the Chevelle had been parked and looked at it for a while. Then he went back to work. The auction and the Chevelle had gotten around. Not loudly. Nolan had not issued a press release or posted anything online, which was his consistent practice and which his one and only attempt at a part-time assistant, a young man named Tyler, who had lasted 4 months before the silence and the pace and the precision requirements drove him back toward more social employment, had described as professionally self-destructive. Nolan did not disagree. He simply also did not change. But Marcus had talked. The Cincinnati restorer had talked. The collector had talked at the right dinner party to the right 3 people, and those people had talked to others, and the old informal telephone network of serious automotive collectors had done what it did, carried signal, slowly and reliably, to the people who needed to receive it. By the time Nolan was 4 vehicles into the 17 from the Decker estate, he had a waiting list. Not a long one. He didn't want a long one. But there were names on a legal pad in his office, serious buyers, vetted through Marcus, who had apparently decided without announcement to serve as an informal intermediary, and the prices those names were willing to pay were not the prices of the auction yard where he'd bought these cars for $2,500 total. The Buick Riviera went to a collector in Tennessee for $47,000. The Lincoln Continental, which had turned out to have a complete and partially intact original interior that took Nolan 6 weeks to correctly restore, working with an upholstery specialist he'd collaborated with twice before. A woman named Carla, who worked out of a converted garage in the next county and whose work was, in Nolan's private assessment, better than anyone else he'd encountered, sold for $39,500. The first Mustang, which was a 1970 Boss 302 that had been covered in 3 coats of mismatched primer by someone who clearly hadn't known what they had, went through a silent auction that Marcus organized. Final price, $88,000. Evelyn Mercer heard about the Mustang on a Thursday morning. She heard it from her head of procurement, who had heard it from a regional auto industry newsletter, which had run a brief item on the sale with a photograph of the finished car. The item mentioned, in its second paragraph, that the restorer had purchased the vehicle at auction as part of a 17-vehicle lot acquired for $2,500. The item further noted that this made it, in the language of automotive investment, one of the better individual per-vehicle returns documented in the regional market in recent memory. She read the item 3 times. Then she pulled up the photograph and looked at the car, deep blue-black over a restored original interior, photographed in Nolan's shop on a sunny morning, and she looked at it for a while. Then she called Derek in and asked him to find out what else was in the Decker estate lot. Derek looked into it. He came back 2 hours later with his tablet and his expression of perpetual mild alarm, and he told her what he'd found. She listened without interrupting, which was not her normal mode in briefings, but something in his tone had communicated that this was information that warranted the departure from habit. The short version was this. Among the 17 vehicles that Nolan Pierce had purchased for a collective $2,500 were 4 cars that any competent assessment would have flagged as highly significant. The Boss 302, the Z/28, the Chevelle, and 1 additional vehicle that had not yet been publicly discussed that Derek had turned up through a reference in an old automotive history database cross-referenced against the partial VYN numbers from the estate inventory. That 4th vehicle was not a production car. It was a prototype, a single, one-of-a-kind development vehicle built during a period that was directly, materially relevant to a legal dispute that Heartstone Motors had been navigating for the better part of 3 years. Derek explained why it was relevant. Evelyn listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Does Pierce know what he has?" she asked. "Unknown," Derek said. "But given the other restorations..." He didn't finish the sentence. "He knows," Evelyn said. She sat back in her chair and looked at the photograph of the Mustang on her screen. "Get me a meeting with him," she said. Derek started to speak. "I'll go to the shop," she said, which was something she did not do. She met people in conference rooms or restaurants or her office, where the architecture of the space communicated the relevant hierarchy. She did not go to machine sheds on county roads. "I'll go to the shop," she said again, as if the second saying of it settled something. Derek updated his calendar, and did not comment. He came on a Wednesday because Evelyn's Wednesday opened up. Her 3 o'clock was pushed to Friday, and she told Derek to reach out to Nolan Pierce's shop. There was no website for Pierce Restoration. There was a phone number listed in the county business directory. Derek called it and got a voicemail that said, in Nolan's unhurried voice, "You've reached Pierce Restoration. Leave your name and number and what you're looking for. I'll call back." Derek left a message that was careful and professional and did not mention Evelyn by name, referring instead to a client interested in discussing potential acquisition and service arrangements. He left a number. Nolan called back in 4 hours. He spoke to Derek for 90 seconds. He said Wednesday at 2 worked fine. He said to come to the shop on Ridgeline. Then he hung up. Derek relayed this to Evelyn. She asked if Nolan had seemed surprised or curious or anything like that. Derek said it was hard to tell. She drove herself, which was also unusual. She didn't feel like having Derek in the car. The shop was smaller than she'd pictured. The gravel driveway, the corrugated shed roof visible behind the main building, the hand-lettered sign that said Pierce Restoration in plain black letters on a white board that had been there long enough to have developed a tan. She pulled in and sat for a moment and then got out. Nolan Pierce came out of the main building when she was halfway across the gravel. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag. He was wearing the same canvas jacket, or one exactly like it. He looked at her, and there was a moment of recognition that was mutual and that neither of them commented on. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Pierce." She extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and did not perform anything. "Come in," he said, and turned back toward the shop. She followed him inside. She had been in restoration shops before. Heartstone's business had brought her into contact with the collector and restoration world enough times that she was not a stranger to the environment. But something about this shop was different, and she spent the first few minutes inside trying to identify what it was. It was not the size or the equipment, though both were adequate. It was not cleanliness, though the floor was immaculate in the specific way of a working shop that gets cleaned daily rather than occasionally. It was the organization. Every tool in its place and every place marked. The reference materials on the shelving above the workbench, binders, manuals, cross-referenced catalogs, arranged with the coherence of a system built by someone who consulted these things constantly. The current project on the lift, a Pontiac of some kind, partially disassembled, with parts laid out on a steel table in a sequence that communicated knowledge of the whole, arranged with a logic that was immediately readable if you knew the language. This was a shop where someone had been doing precise, disciplined work for a very long time. She looked at the Pontiac on the lift. "What year?" she said. "68, Nolan said. He was watching her look around. She nodded. She walked to the workbench and looked at the tools without touching anything. Then she turned around. "I'll assume you know why I'm here," she said. "I have a reasonable guess," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she'd noticed at the auction and was noticing again now. He was simply not uncomfortable in the low-grade constant way that most people were uncomfortable around her. It was not defiance. It was not performance. It was just that he appeared to have his attention somewhere other than on her assessment of him. "The prototype," she said. He nodded slowly. "Do you have it?" "I do." "Is it restorable?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's in better condition than the other 16 vehicles were when I acquired them." "Mr. Pierce." She clasped her hands in front of her. "I don't want to waste your time or mine with a lot of preamble, so I'm going to be direct. Heartstone Motors is involved in a federal lawsuit that hinges on a question of development priority. That prototype, if it is what our research suggests it is, would constitute material evidence in that case. We need access to it." "I know," Nolan said. That stopped her. "You know." "I've read about the lawsuit. It's not hard to find." He leaned back against the workbench, not quite crossing his arms, something in between. "I know what you need it for." Evelyn studied him. "Then you understand why we need to talk about acquisition." "We can talk about it," he said. She named a number. It was a number her legal team had arrived at through a calculus of urgency, legal exposure, and estimated fair market value for a prototype of this type. It was a substantial number. Nolan listened to the number. Then he said, I appreciate that. I'll need to think about it. Mr. Pierce, the trial begins in 11 weeks. I'm aware of that, he said. He straightened and picked up the shop rag he'd set down. Give me a few days. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to being asked to wait. She ran a company. She made decisions, and other people operated on timelines shaped by those decisions. The feeling of being told to give me a few days by a man in a machine shed on a county road was not a familiar one. Of course, she heard herself say. She left. She sat in her car for a moment in the gravel lot. Through the open door of the shop, she could hear the sound of a tool on metal. A measured, careful sound, neither urgent nor slow. She started the car and drove back toward the city. She thought about what her appraisers had said about the 17 vehicles. She thought about the Boss 302 on the screen of her phone. She thought about a man who had raised his hand in a cold auction yard for $2,500 and had simply, without argument, without performance, without anything except the unhurried certainty of someone who knew something nobody else in the room knew, gotten to work. By the time she hit the county road back to the highway, she had stopped thinking about the prototype for the first time in 8 months. She was thinking about something else entirely, and she was not quite able to say what. She gave him 4 days before she called. Not Derek, Evelyn herself, from her direct line, at 8:40 in the morning. Nolan was under the Pontiac when his phone rang, and he slid out on the creeper, looked at the number he didn't recognize, and answered it anyway because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize. You never knew who was calling about what, and in his experience, the calls that mattered most were usually the ones from numbers you hadn't saved yet. Mr. Pierce, she said, it's Evelyn Mercer. I hope I'm not interrupting. You're not, he said, which was not quite true, but was also not important enough to correct. I wanted to follow up on our conversation. I figured. He sat up on the creeper, elbows on his knees. I've been thinking about it. A pause. And I'd like a little more time, he said. There was a quality to the silence on her end that he recognized. Not anger exactly, but the specific pressure of a person accustomed to controlling timelines, being reminded that not everyone operates inside their timeline. He'd heard that silence before, from different people, in different contexts. It had a recognizable texture. The trial, she began. I know about the trial, he said. I told you I did. I'm not trying to be difficult, Ms. Mercer. I'm trying to make sure that when I decide something, I've decided it right. Another pause, shorter this time. How long do you need? End of the week, he said. That's Friday. Yes. She said she would call Friday afternoon. He said that was fine. Then they hung up and he slid back under the Pontiac. He had not told her the truth about what he was doing with the extra time. He wasn't deliberating about the price, though that was certainly part of it. What he was actually doing was something he needed to finish thinking through, in the way he thought through things. Slowly, without forcing the shape, letting the whole picture develop before he acted on any part of it. His father had called this stubbornness. Nolan had always maintained it was something else, though he'd never found a word for it that didn't sound like an excuse. What he was thinking about was condition. He had not told Evelyn Mercer the full extent of what he'd found when he began preliminary work on the prototype. He'd confirmed its identity, VIN research, cross-referenced manufacturing records, 2 careful calls to the same contacts who had confirmed the Z28, both of whom had gone very quiet on the phone in a way that communicated something beyond ordinary professional interest. He'd confirmed that the car's major structural components were intact, that the body damage was surface rather than structural, and that beneath the accumulated grime and corrosion and the evidence of however many decades of agricultural storage, the bones were there. What he hadn't told her was that it needed significant work before it could serve as meaningful physical evidence in a legal proceeding. Or more precisely, he hadn't told her how much he already wanted to do that work, and why, and what that wanting might mean for the negotiation ahead. The week that followed Evelyn's visit was the kind of week that happened in the shop sometimes. Dense, accumulated, the hours going faster than they should in a place where time was supposed to move slowly. He had the Pontiac to finish. He had a '65 Corvette belonging to a collector in Nashville whose patience was running thin after 3 delays, each caused by component sourcing issues that Nolan had explained carefully and that the collector had understood intellectually while remaining emotionally unsatisfied. And he had the prototype in the corner of the storage shed under a canvas tarp, occupying a disproportionate amount of his mental real estate for a car he wasn't officially working on yet. The Nashville collector called on Thursday. His name was Hargrove, first name Phil, though he introduced himself as Hargrove the way people did when they wanted to establish something about themselves without quite saying it. And he had the impatient energy of a man who had spent his life expecting the world to move faster than it did. "Give me an honest date, Pierce," Hargrove said. It was not the first time in this conversation he had used the word honest, which Nolan noted without commenting on. 2 weeks? Nolan said. Maybe 3. You said 2 weeks 3 weeks ago. I said approximately 2 weeks, and then I found that the cylinder head on the small block had a hairline I missed on first inspection. I'm not sending you a car with a compromised cylinder head. Can you source a replacement? I have one. It came in Tuesday. Correct date code. Then why 3 weeks? Because now that I've pulled the head, I can see other things I couldn't see before. That's how this works. I don't mean that as a criticism, Mr. Hargrove. I mean it as information. A long pause. What else? The valve timing is off, not catastrophically, but off enough that I'm going to correct it, which I can do right. Or I can correct it quickly. I don't do quickly. Hargrove made a sound on the phone that was part frustration and part something that was almost, against his apparent will, respect. Fine, he said. 3 weeks, not 4. I'll do my best, Nolan said. Your best had better be 3 weeks, Hargrove said, and hung up. Nolan set the phone down on the workbench and went back to the Pontiac. His best was usually exactly what he said it would be, and Hargrove probably knew that by now, which was why the man kept using him despite the timelines. Some people knew quality and needed it enough to tolerate the cost of acquiring it. They complained because complaining was how they metabolized the waiting, but they waited anyway. That evening, after he'd cleaned up and eaten, he went back out to the storage shed with a flashlight and a notepad and spent 2 hours with the prototype. He moved around it slowly, the way he moved around all of them at this stage, not looking for anything specific or looking for everything specific, which amounted to the same thing. He opened the hood. He noted what was there and what wasn't. He checked the firewall stampings, which confirmed what he'd already confirmed from the VIN research. He looked at the interior, which had been gutted at some point. The seats gone, most of the dashboard components removed, though the structural elements were all present. He noted the mounting points for equipment that would have been installed during the development process, equipment that was gone now but that left traces in the metal. Drill patterns, bracket mounts, routing channels for wiring that no production car would have had. This was, beyond any reasonable doubt, what the database record said it was. A development prototype from a specific program at a specific time. One of a kind. He sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket next to the car and looked at it in the flashlight's beam. His father had, near the end of his working life, talked sometimes about the ones that got away. The cars that had passed through the auction system or the estate sales without anyone recognizing them, that had ended up crushed or parted out or simply disappeared. He'd had a grief for those cars that was genuine, that Nolan had found mildly excessive as a younger man, and that he understood better now. It wasn't sentiment about objects, it was grief for irreplaceability. For the particular cruelty of losing things that could not be made again. This car was one of those things, and for whatever combination of reasons, Decker's acquisition instincts, the specific opacity of his organizational system, the misfortune of dying without a will, it had ended up here instead of gone. Nolan had been offered money for it, good money. He was going to accept money for it eventually because he had a shop to run and a mortgage that his father had left with 9 years still on it, and because Heartstone Motors' need for the prototype was real and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But he was going to do it right, and doing it right was going to require something beyond money. Marcus Webb called on Friday morning, before Evelyn did. I heard she came out, Marcus said. No preamble. He had evidently decided at some point in their developing acquaintance that preamble was unnecessary. She did, Nolan said. And? And she's calling this afternoon. She's going to push hard, Marcus said. I want you to know that what you have, and I think we both know what you have, is worth more than whatever her first number was. Probably more than her second number. I know that, Nolan said. There are collectors who would pay a... I know there are, Nolan said. That's not the only consideration. A pause. What are the other considerations? The car belongs in the record, Nolan said, not in a garage in Tennessee. He paused. No offense to garages in Tennessee. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Pierce, he said, with the particular tone of someone choosing their words with care, what are you planning? I'm planning to have a conversation this afternoon, Nolan said. I'll let you know how it goes. Don't undersell yourself, Marcus said. I'm not in the habit of it, Nolan said. Marcus made a sound that might have been a laugh. No, he said. I suppose you're not. Evelyn called at 2:15. I've had my legal team look at the timeline again, she said. We need to file the supplemental evidence brief no later than 7 weeks from Monday. That means we need physical access to the prototype, verified and documented, within the next 3 weeks. I understand the timeline, Nolan said. Then you understand why I need an answer today. I have an answer, he said, but it's not a simple yes or no. A pause. Explain. He'd spent the morning organizing what he wanted to say, not in the form of notes. He didn't write out speeches, but in the way he organized mechanical problems, understanding the components and their relationships before he spoke to the whole. He'd had this conversation in his head several times, and each time arrived at the same place, which told him it was probably the right place. The prototype needs work before it's useful to you in court, he said. Not cosmetic work, documentation work. The development components have to be identified, cataloged, and verified by someone with the credentials to testify to their authenticity. That's going to take at minimum 2 weeks of careful work, and it has to be done by someone who knows what they're looking at. Our legal team has expert witnesses. Your expert witnesses haven't seen the car, he said. I have. I've spent 2 hours in the dark with a flashlight, and I can tell you that the documentation you're going to need is not something you can get by walking someone through it in an afternoon. There are mounting points on the firewall that correspond to engineering specifications your legal team won't recognize without context. There are stampings and date codes and modified components that tell a story, but only if someone can read the story. Your experts will be able to testify to what they're shown, but someone has to show it to them correctly. Silence on the other end. Are you telling me you want to be part of the restoration and documentation process? Evelyn said. I'm telling you I'm probably the most qualified person available to do it, Nolan said. That's not arrogance. Marcus Webb will tell you the same thing if you ask him. Marcus Webb is, she started. He'll tell you the same thing, Nolan said again, quietly. Another silence. He waited. All right, she said. What are you asking for? He told her. The price was significant, not extortionate, but the number of a man who understood what he had and had decided not to pretend otherwise. It was also, and this was the part that took him longer to say, not the only thing he was asking for. There's a condition, he said. The word condition landed on her end with palpable weight. What condition? Heartstone Motors funds a vocational program, he said. Ongoing, not a one-time grant. Specifically for classic automobile restoration. Based out of Mill Haven, open to anyone in the county. Real curriculum, real equipment, run by people who actually know the craft. The silence that followed this was different from the earlier silences. It was the silence of someone genuinely recalibrating. That's, Evelyn started. It's a program that doesn't exist here, Nolan said. The people who know how to do this work are getting older. What my father knew, what I know, it doesn't transfer automatically. Someone has to teach it. Someone has to build the infrastructure to teach it. And a company with Heartstone's resources can do that without it making a material difference to the bottom line. Mr. Pierce, this is the condition, he said. The price is negotiable within a range. The condition is not. He heard her breathing. He waited. I need to discuss this with my board, she said finally. That's fine, he said. You have my number. She hung up without saying goodbye, which he took as a reasonable indicator that the conversation had gone in a direction she hadn't anticipated. He set his phone down and went back to the Pontiac, because the valve timing wasn't going to correct itself, and Hargrove's 3-week clock was running. What he didn't know, and wouldn't learn until later, was what happened on Evelyn's end of the call. She sat in her office for 11 minutes after the call ended. Her assistant had a log, without answering emails or picking up other calls. Derek, who had learned through painful experience to read the indicators of her mental state with some precision, brought her coffee and retreated without speaking. At the end of 11 minutes, she picked up her phone and called her general counsel, a sharp and perpetually overworked attorney named Sandra Cho, and said, "The seller has a condition." She explained the condition. Sandra's response was immediate. "That's not a deal breaker from a legal standpoint. The liability exposure of the lawsuit makes the total cost structure entirely favorable even with a vocational program commitment." "I know that," Evelyn said. "Then what?" "I just wanted to say it out loud to someone," Evelyn said, and hung up. She was not someone who said things out loud to hear herself. She was not that kind of person. But there was something about the conversation with Nolan Pierce that had required processing in a way that her normal processing mechanisms weren't quite handling, and she needed another mind in the loop even briefly. What bothered her was not the condition. The condition was, as Sandra had correctly and instantly identified, not a deal breaker. It was even, from a reputational standpoint, a reasonable piece of corporate community investment that her communications team could work with. What bothered her was the certainty in his voice when he said the condition is not negotiable. Not the certainty of someone bluffing, or the certainty of someone making an emotional decision and dressing it as a principle. The certainty of someone who had thought something through completely and arrived at the far end of it and was simply reporting what he found there. She had been in negotiations for 30 years. She had sat across from board members and investors and union representatives and regulatory officials and rival executives, and she had learned, through the accumulated experience of all of those rooms, to hear the difference between a position and a conviction. A position you could move. A conviction you had to accommodate or walk away from. Nolan Pierce had a conviction. She sat for a while longer, and then she called her board members. 2 days after the call, Hearthstone sent a formal letter of intent. It came by courier, which was not how most of Nolan's correspondence arrived. The usual run was emails and phone calls and occasional hand-delivered notes from Marcus, who maintained that handwriting was a mark of seriousness. The courier arrived at 10 in the morning while Nolan was in the middle of a delicate piece of timing work on the Corvette's small block, and he made the courier wait 12 minutes until he reached a stopping point before he came out to sign for it. He read the letter at his workbench, standing up without sitting down. The price was in the range he'd stated. The language around the vocational program was still tentative, intent to explore the establishment of rather than the harder commitment he'd asked for, but it was on paper, which was further than he'd gotten in the phone call. He read the legal language carefully. His father had drilled that into him from an early age. Read the whole thing, not the parts that look good, the whole thing. He called Marcus. "The intent language is soft," Marcus said immediately. Nolan had read him the relevant paragraph. "Intent to explore means nothing. You want commitment to establish." "I know. Don't sign what they sent. I wasn't planning to." "What's your response?" Nolan thought about it. "I'll call her directly," he said. "Not her legal team. Her." Marcus paused. "You sure about that?" "She made the decision to come to the shop herself," Nolan said. "That means something about how she wants to handle this." "Or it means she was calculating the advantage of the personal touch," Marcus said. He was not cynical by nature, but 30 years in any industry left deposits. "Maybe," Nolan said. "But I don't think so. Not entirely." He called her that afternoon. She answered on the second ring, which again was something he noted. "I got the letter," he said. "I thought you might be calling." "The intent language needs to change," he said. "I need a commitment to establish the program, with timeline and funding floor specified. Not an intent to explore." A pause. "That's a significant ask for a letter of intent." "It's a significant prototype, he said. "And the intent language is what makes the letter of intent worth signing." "Mr. Pierce." There was something in her voice that was different from the earlier calls. Not softer exactly, but less armored. "I want you to understand that I don't normally agree to conditions in situations like this." I know, he said. I'm asking anyway. Another pause, longer. Give me 2 days, she said. You have them, he said. He set the phone down and went back to the Corvette. The valve timing was closer now. Another hour, maybe 2, and he'd be able to test it properly and know what he was actually dealing with. While Nolan waited, the world around the Decker estate lot had not been standing still. Marcus, whose informal role had expanded naturally and without either of them formally acknowledging it, had been fielding inquiries. The automotive collector community had its own velocity of information, its own set of channels through which significant news traveled with speed inversely proportional to the formality of the communication. By the time the Corvette sale was confirmed, $88,000 to a collector in North Carolina who had driven up from Charlotte to look at it in person and had handed Nolan a certified check within 30 minutes of arrival. There were 4 separate parties who had contacted Marcus expressing interest in whatever else might be coming out of the Ridgeline Road shop. Marcus had given them all the same answer: wait. He had also, without asking Nolan's permission because he had known Nolan long enough to know that asking first would have resulted in a refusal, made a call to Douglas Ferentz, the Cincinnati restorer who'd come out for the Chevelle assessment. Douglas had a contact at an automotive history foundation in Detroit, a nonprofit that maintained the most comprehensive archive of American production vehicle documentation in the country. Marcus had mentioned the Decker estate lot in passing. He had mentioned, still in passing, that certain of the vehicles had turned out to be of unusual historical interest. He had been careful about specifics. The man in Detroit, whose name was Louis Garfield, and who had been running the foundation for 18 years, had called Marcus back within the hour. What kind of unusual historical interest? He'd asked. The significant kind, Marcus had said. Garfield had asked to be kept informed. Marcus had said he would. Then he'd called Nolan and mentioned the conversation. Nolan listened without commenting for a while. Then he said, Marcus? I know, Marcus said. I appreciate the thinking behind it. But I need to manage this myself, the timeline and the terms. You're already managing it, Marcus said. I'm just making sure you have options. Nolan was quiet. Then, what do you know about Garfield? 22 years in automotive history and preservation, legitimate foundation. They've done documentation work on 3 major prototype discoveries in the last decade. Another pause. Keep him warm, Nolan said finally, but don't commit to anything. That was always the plan, Marcus said, with the mild self-satisfaction of someone who had correctly anticipated the outcome of a conversation they'd started. The revised letter arrived 4 days after the first. This time, no courier. It came as a PDF attachment to an email from Evelyn's direct address, not her legal team's, at 7:40 in the morning. Nolan read it on his laptop at the workbench before he started work. Outside, the October light had turned to November light, harder, more horizontal, carrying the particular flat quality that came to this part of the state when the leaves were mostly down and the sky couldn't quite decide between blue and gray. The language on the vocational program had changed. Commitment to establish was there now. A funding floor, lower than he'd have chosen, but real, was specified. A timeline for program launch was included, 18 months from execution of the final agreement. He read it twice. He called Marcus. Better, Marcus said. Not perfect. Deals rarely are, Marcus said. Is it enough? Nolan thought about his father, about the way his father used to talk about the programs he'd wished for when he was starting out, the teachers and the spaces and the organized knowledge transfer that the trade had never systematically built and that it paid for every generation in the rediscovery of things that should have been passed forward, about how Ray Pierce had taught Nolan everything he knew in a shop exactly like this one-on-one, because there had been no other way to get it. It's enough to start, Nolan said. That's usually how important things begin, Marcus said. Nolan set down the phone and looked out through the open shop door at the storage shed. The tarp over the prototype moved slightly in the wind, coming under the corrugated roof. He could see the corner of the rear bumper. He'd need to call Evelyn today. There were details to finalize. An actual agreement to execute, which would require his own attorney, a woman named Patricia Varnes in town who handled his business contracts and who would want 2 days at minimum to review anything Heartstone's lawyers had touched. There was the documentation work to plan, the timeline to establish, the question of where and how the verification process would be conducted. There was a lot of work ahead. There was always a lot of work ahead. He picked up the phone to call Evelyn, and then he put it down again, and he walked out to the storage shed instead. He pulled the tarp back and looked at the car in the November light coming through the shed's open face. It was ugly, genuinely, the way only deeply neglected things could be ugly. Not the dignified rust of age, but the specific degradation of abandonment, of being left in a field or a barn while seasons accumulated and metal surrendered itself by degrees. But under all of that, if you knew how to look, the lines were still there. The shape that someone had designed and built for a purpose was still readable, the way old handwriting was still readable even when the ink had faded. His father would have known what this was immediately, would have known it the way he knew the sound of a misfire from 50 feet away, the way he knew the particular color that indicated specific types of surface rust versus the kind that had gone deeper. It was the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime spent paying attention, and it was the thing Nolan had spent his own lifetime trying to preserve and extend and eventually pass forward. He put the tarp back. He went inside and picked up his phone and called Evelyn Mercer and told her he was ready to talk terms. She answered on the first ring this time. Patricia Varnes took 3 days, not 2. She called Nolan on a Thursday evening after 7, which was outside her normal office hours, and which told him something about either her level of engagement with the document or her level of concern about it, possibly both. He was cleaning up after a long day on the Pontiac, wiping down the workbench, returning tools to their places, when the phone rang. "I've gone through Heartstone's agreement," she said. "Twice." "And?" "The main structure is fine. The price terms are clear. The transfer of title is properly constructed. The liability language is reasonable." She paused in the particular way of someone approaching the part of the conversation that required more care. "The vocational program commitment is where I want to talk." Nolan set down the shop rag. "What's the problem?" "The funding floor is specified, but the enforcement mechanism is weak. If they miss the 18-month launch timeline, the only remedy in the current language is a renegotiation clause, which effectively means they can push it indefinitely as long as they keep talking to you." "I noticed that," Nolan said. "You want a penalty structure," Patricia said. "Automatic reversion of some portion of the proceeds, or a fixed penalty if the program isn't launched within the agreed window. Can you get that in?" "I can try. Heartstone's lawyers are not going to love it." "I don't need them to love it," Nolan said. "I need it in the agreement." A pause. "I'll draft the language and send it over in the morning. You should know, though, adding teeth to that clause might slow the whole thing down. They've got a court deadline." "I know about their deadline," he said. "Send me the draft." He hung up and finished wiping down the bench. Outside, the November dark had come down completely, and the only light was the fluorescent bar over the workbench and the orange security light above the shed door. He looked at the storage shed through the window. The call to Evelyn that morning had been shorter than he expected. She'd been clipped and precise, the pressure of the approaching trial audible in the efficiency of her language. They had agreed on a meeting the following week to walk through the agreement in detail, with both sets of attorneys present. Nolan had asked whether she wanted to do it at Heartstone's offices. She had said the shop was fine. He hadn't been sure whether to read that as a power gesture, meeting on her terms without saying so, or as something more straightforward. He still wasn't sure. He turned off the workbench light and locked the shop. Boss. Patricia's draft revision arrived at 6:47 the following morning, which suggested she had either started early or not entirely stopped from the night before. The penalty language was clear. If the program failed to launch within 24 months, she'd extended the window from 18 to give them room, she explained in her note, which would make Heartstone's lawyers more likely to accept the teeth in exchange. A fixed sum would revert to an escrow account managed by a third-party educational nonprofit, specifically earmarked for vocational training purposes, regardless of what happened to the broader program commitment. Nolan read it twice. He forwarded it to Evelyn's direct email with a single line. "My attorneys suggested revision to Section 4. Let me know if this creates problems on your end." He sent it at 7:15 and then went to work on the Pontiac, because the valve timing was finally where he wanted it, and he needed to run the engine under load and document the results, and the document results were what he would need when he called Hargrove and told him the car was getting close. The response from Evelyn came at 11:03 while he was on the phone with a supplier in Ohio about a specific carburetor component he needed for the next vehicle in the Decker estate sequence. The response was 4 words: "I'll bring it up," which was not a yes, but it was also not a no. And in Nolan's experience of how people communicated when they were actually going to do a thing, 4 words delivered directly by the decision maker within 4 hours was about as good an early signal as you got. He finished the call with Ohio, confirmed the component was available and would ship by Friday, and went back to the engine. Hargrove arrived that Saturday. He drove up from Nashville in a rental car, having flown into the regional airport rather than drive, which Nolan took as an indication that the timeline pressure had become specific enough to warrant the plane ticket, though Hargrove would almost certainly describe it differently if asked. He arrived at 40 minutes earlier than they'd agreed, and Nolan was still in the middle of a final road check documentation when the rental car turned into the gravel lot. He let Hargrove wait 15 minutes. Not as a point, but because the documentation was not done and he was not going to leave it half done. When he came out, Hargrove was standing next to his rental car with his arms folded and the expression of someone who had decided that the waiting would not be acknowledged. "Mr. Hargrove," Nolan said. "Pierce," Hargrove said. He looked at the shop. "The Corvette done?" "It's done," Nolan said. "Come in." The Corvette was on the floor of the main shop, not on the lift. Finished cars came off the lift and onto the floor, where the light hit them from the correct angle, and you could walk all the way around them. It was a 1965 Stingray Fastback in Nassau blue over a correct black interior, and it was, Nolan knew with the particular unsentimental assessment that came from finishing something correctly, very good work. Hargrove stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He walked to the driver's side and crouched and looked along the rocker panel. He stood and opened the door and looked at the interior. He walked around the rear and looked at the tail. He came back to the front and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the whole thing. "The cylinder head you replaced," he said finally. "Correct date code, correct casting number matching to the engine," Nolan said. "I have the documentation." "Can I drive it?" "I'd rather you didn't today," Nolan said. "I want another 72 hours on the engine before I'm comfortable with extended driving. The valve timing work required a full reseat, and I like to see at least 2 heat cycles before—" "Fine," Hargrove said. He had the tone of someone overriding an objection they were technically accepting. "I'll arrange transport and come back in 2 weeks to pick it up." "That works," Nolan said. Hargrove looked at the car for another moment. Then he looked at Nolan. "It's better than the photos," he said. Nolan said nothing. "I'll have my guy call you about transport logistics." Hargrove started toward the door, then stopped. "The Decker estate lot. I've heard things." Nolan waited. "Are there other Corvettes in it?" "No," Nolan said. "Other significant vehicles?" "I'm working through the lot," Nolan said. "When something's ready to go to a buyer, Marcus Webb will be in touch with interested parties." Hargrove looked at him with the calculating look of someone trying to find an angle of approach that the other person hadn't already thought of. "I'm a serious buyer," he said. "That's worth something." "I know you're a serious buyer," Nolan said. "Marcus has your information." Hargrove held the look for another moment, then dropped it. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Nolan confirmed. Hargrove left. The gravel popped under his rental car's tires as he pulled out, and then it was quiet again. Nolan looked at the Corvette in the morning light. Then he went to make coffee. The meeting at the shop happened on a Tuesday, 11 days after the call. Evelyn came with Sandra Cho, her general counsel, and a second attorney named Perot, who specialized in intellectual property and had the alert, slightly coiled energy of someone perpetually prepared to identify a problem before it became visible to anyone else. Nolan had Patricia with him, and Marcus, who had inserted himself into the meeting with the calm confidence of someone who had decided their presence was appropriate and was prepared to argue the point if challenged, though it turned out no one challenged it. They sat at a folding table that Nolan had set up in the middle of the main shop. He'd moved the current project to the far side of the space, which gave them room, but also meant they were surrounded by the smell of the shop, oil and metal and the specific chemical undertone of cleaning solvents. And by its sounds, or rather its particular silence, the silence of a working space at rest. Sandra Cho had the document on her laptop. Patricia had her copy printed and annotated, which Nolan had always found more useful in contract discussions. The ability to physically mark pages communicated a level of preparation that pure screen reading didn't. They went through it section by section. Most of it moved quickly. The price structure was agreed, the documentation timeline was confirmed, the transfer conditions were laid out. Perrault had 2 questions about the authentication process that Nolan answered without consulting Patricia, which earned a brief look from Evelyn that Nolan noticed but didn't respond to. They arrived at section 4. The penalty structure, Sandra Cho said. She said it in the tone of someone announcing a subject they had spent time with. We've reviewed Ms. Varnes's proposed revision. And, Patricia said, we can accept the escrow mechanism, Sandra said. The amount is higher than we'd like. She named a counterfigure. Patricia looked at Nolan. Nolan considered. Split the difference, he said. A pause. Sandra looked at Evelyn. Something passed between them. The particular compressed communication of 2 people who had worked together long enough to hold a negotiation inside a glance. We can do that, Evelyn said. Perrault typed something. Patricia made a note. The meeting took 2 hours and 20 minutes. At the end of it, they had an agreement in principle that would require final drafting, 2 or 3 days, Patricia estimated, assuming no new issues emerged on either side, and an execution date scheduled for the following Monday. When Sandra and Perrault had gathered their materials and stepped outside to take separate calls, and Patricia had walked to her car to retrieve something, Nolan and Evelyn were briefly alone in the shop. She was looking at the work in progress on the far side of the space. The Pontiac on the lift, the parts laid out on the steel table, the systematic organization of a project mid-execution. How many of the 17 are left? She said. 9, he said. She nodded. She looked at the pegboard tool wall, at the binders on the shelf, at the yellow legal pads stacked at the end of the workbench, a dozen of them at least, project notes accumulated over years. My appraisers, she said, not quite turning to face him. The ones I sent to assess the Decker lot. What about them? I'd like to know what they actually looked at versus what they thought they looked at. She turned then. Her face had the composed, precise quality that he'd noticed at the auction, but something was different in it now. Less the composure of control and more the composure of someone who had processed something difficult and arrived at the other side of it. I'm not asking you to explain their work. I'm asking, were they even in a position to know? Nolan leaned against the workbench. Probably not, he said. Knowing what to look for in a car like that, the specific markers of a development vehicle from that period, it's not something you have without a particular kind of background. Your appraisers would have been correct about the production vehicles, the Chevelle, the Camaro, the Mustangs. Without pulling them apart and reading the specific stampings and casting numbers, a reasonable assessment would have been what they said it was. But you knew, she said. I'd spent time with the estate inventory before the auction, he said, and I know what I'm looking for. Because of your father, she said. It was not quite a question. He looked at her. Marcus mentioned him, she said. Not in a revealing way. It came up. Nolan said nothing for a moment. My father spent most of his adult life learning to read these cars the way other people learn to read books. He passed it along. To you. To me, he said. She looked at the shop again, at all of it, the whole space. I made a comment at the auction, she said, about what you'd bought. I remember. It was... She stopped, started differently. It was the kind of assessment I make every day, fast, based on visible information, framed with confidence because that's how I'm expected to operate. But in that case, it was wrong, and I said it publicly, and I said it about someone who knew significantly more about the subject than I did. Nolan waited. I'm not particularly comfortable with being wrong in public, she said. There was a dryness in her voice that was not quite humor and not quite not humor. Most people aren't, he said. I imagine you noticed at the auction that I was wrong. Yes, he said. And you didn't say anything. It wasn't the time, he said. And it wasn't going to change what I'd just bought. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, undecorated attention of someone genuinely registering another person. Then Sandra Cho came back through the door, and the moment closed. Well, the agreement was executed the following Monday. Patricia and Sandra handled the formal exchange, while Nolan and Evelyn stood on the same side of the folding table for the first time, both watching their attorneys work through the document. It was a small thing, that shared side of the table, but Nolan noticed it. After the signing, Perot asked if they could see the prototype. Nolan led them out to the storage shed. He pulled the tarp back. The car sat in the flat November light, 17 years of neglect still fully present on its surfaces, its character still obscured by everything that had happened to it since it left whatever facility had built it. Perot crouched immediately and began examining the VIN area with a flashlight he produced from his inside pocket. Sandra took photographs on her phone. Evelyn stood back and looked at the whole car. "You'll begin documentation this week?" Perot asked without looking up. "Yes," Nolan said. "We'll need to coordinate with our expert witness. He'll need access to the vehicle, your documentation, and your notes on the component identification." "I know," Nolan said. "Patricia has my availability." Perot stood up. He looked at the car with the focused assessment of someone reading a legal brief. "The firewall stampings you mentioned," he said. "Can you show me?" Nolan opened the hood. He pointed, without touching anything, to 3 separate areas of the firewall. He explained in terms a non-mechanic could follow, but without condescending to the intelligence in the room, what each marking represented and why it was significant. Perot listened with his flashlight moving where Nolan pointed. Sandra had moved around to the driver's side and was photographing through the window. "The mounting points here," Nolan said, indicating a pair of fabricated brackets on the right side of the firewall, "are for instrumentation that would have been present during development testing. Those brackets are not on any production vehicle. They don't appear in any parts catalog. They exist because someone built them specifically for this car for a specific purpose, and that purpose is documented in engineering records that your legal team should already have." Perot looked at the brackets. He looked at Nolan. "You've cross-referenced this against the engineering records?" "Against what's publicly available, yes," Nolan said. "I'd expect your records to be more complete." Perot made a note on his phone. He looked at Sandra, who gave a small nod. They went back inside. Evelyn had stayed by the car after the others moved, and Nolan waited. "When you restore it," she said, not quite making it a question, "what does that process actually look like?" He thought about how to answer. "You start with what you can see," he said. "Surface condition, structural integrity, component inventory. Then you go deeper. You document everything before you change anything. Every piece that comes off gets photographed, measured, cataloged. Because the documentation is as important as the restoration, maybe more important, in a case like this." "And the car itself?" "The car gets treated like what it is," he said. "A one-of-a-kind thing that belongs to a specific moment in time. You can't make it new again, and you shouldn't try. You can make it correct again. You can make it legible." He looked at the car under its tarp. "That's the work." Evelyn listened to this. She didn't say anything immediately. Then, "My father had a car," she said. It came out differently from the way she usually spoke. Less edited, less composed, like something she hadn't planned to say and was examining as she said it. "A 1971 Dodge Challenger. He bought it before I was born. By the time I was old enough to remember it, it was in pieces in our garage. He was always going to restore it." She paused. "He never did." Nolan looked at her. "He sold it eventually," she said. "Piece by piece, over a few years, when money got difficult. He needed the parts money more than he needed the project." She was quiet for a moment. "I haven't thought about that car in years." Nolan didn't say anything. He understood instinctively that the silence was the correct response. She straightened slightly, and the composed executive register came back into her posture. "I'll have Sandra send you the expert witness contact information today," she said. "That's fine," he said. They walked back to the shop. But the documentation work took 17 days. Not because the car required it exactly, but because Nolan's standard was what it was, and he was not going to shortchange it because of external timelines. He worked methodically, the way he always worked. photographs before anything else, comprehensive and overlapping, then written notes in the legal pad, then measurements, then the careful examination of each component that required examination. The expert witness Hartstone sent was a man named Dr. Robert Kehane, a retired mechanical engineer who had spent 20 years in corporate automotive development and who now consulted in litigation where technical authenticity was in question. He was 67, thin, with the specific combination of physical economy and intellectual intensity that Nolan associated with people who had spent decades needing to be right about things that mattered. He arrived on a Wednesday in a rental car and a good wool coat and spent 8 hours in the shed. The interaction between Kehane and Nolan had the particular quality of two people who respected the same things and were assessing each other against those shared standards. They spoke a common technical language, which was itself a kind of credential exchange. By the third hour, Kehane was asking Nolan questions that were not rhetorical, not testing him, but genuinely asking because the answers were useful. "The wiring routing here," Kehane said, pointing to a channel in the firewall. "Do you know what instrumentation it was running?" "Based on the channel dimensions and the bracket spacing, I'd estimate a minimum of 3 data leads for engine parameter monitoring," Nolan said, "plus at least one external sensor feed. The routing is consistent with what they were doing in development testing in that period." Kehane looked at him. "You've studied the program documentation." "What's publicly available?" Nolan said again. "The non-public records confirm your interpretation," Kehane said. He didn't elaborate on how he knew that, and Nolan didn't ask. By the end of day 2, Kehane had what he needed. He sat in the plastic chair Nolan kept in the shed for extended work sessions and made notes for 45 minutes while Nolan worked on a separate vehicle at the other end of the space. When Kehane was done, he stood and offered his hand. "Thorough work," he said. "Thank you," Nolan said. "I mean the documentation," Kehane said, "and the identification. Most people wouldn't have known what they were looking at." "My father taught me what to look for," Nolan said. Kehane nodded with the particular acknowledgement of someone who understood the weight of that kind of transmission. "I'll file my assessment with Hartstone's legal team by Friday." "Good," Nolan said. Kehane looked at the prototype one more time before he left. "It should be properly restored," he said, almost to himself. "After this is over." "That's the plan," Nolan said. What Nolan did not know, because there was no reason he would have known it, was that across town the opposing legal team in Hartstone's case had discovered, through their own investigative work, that the prototype existed and had been located. This was, from their standpoint, a significant and unwelcome development. The legal theory of their case depended in part on the premise that Hartstone could not demonstrate physical evidence of the development timeline they were claiming. The prototype, properly authenticated, would undercut that premise substantially. They made 2 attempts to reach Nolan. The first was a phone call from an attorney named Garrett Walsh, who introduced himself as representing a third party with an interest in the matter and expressed a wish to discuss the prototype's status. Nolan listened to the introduction, asked Walsh who specifically he represented, received a carefully circumlocutive answer that was technically not a lie and was also clearly not the whole truth, and said he would not be able to help and wished Walsh a good day. Walsh called back 2 days later with a number. The number was larger than Hartstone's price. Nolan said, "I have an agreement with Hartstone Motors. I'm not in the market for a competing offer." "The agreement isn't executed yet," Walsh said. He had done his homework. "It is, actually," Nolan said. It had been executed 4 days earlier. A pause. "Mr. Pierce, I want to make sure you understand the full picture of what—" "I understand the full picture," Nolan said. "I'm not interested in the offer. Don't call again." He hung up. He sat for a moment in the shop, in the particular quiet that followed that kind of conversation. He was not bothered by it exactly. He'd expected something like it, once the information was out in the legal world that the prototype had been located. But there was a residue from those calls, a low-grade unpleasantness, the feeling of being treated as a variable in someone else's calculation, a number that could be moved if the right other number was placed next to it. He picked up his phone and called Patricia. He told her about the calls. "Document them," she said. Write down the times, the number Walsh called from, what was said. Don't respond to any further contact. If they reach out again, refer them directly to me. Already done, he said. He'd written it in the legal pad while the conversation was still in his head. And Nolan? Patricia said. She used his first name rarely enough that it functioned as a tonal marker. They're going to escalate. If they can't get to you directly, they'll try another angle. What kind of angle? I don't know yet, she said, but be aware. He thanked her and hung up. He looked at the notes he'd written. Then he looked through the shop window at the storage shed. The other angle, it turned out, came 3 days later, and it did not come from Walsh. It came from a man named Terrence Cole, who showed up at the shop on a Friday afternoon with a business card that said Cole Automotive Consulting, and a demeanor that was positioned carefully between casual interest and professional inquiry. He said he'd heard about the Decker estate lot through the collector network, that he was working with a client who had a specific interest in development-era vehicles, and that he'd like to discuss whether any of the remaining vehicles in the lot were available. Nolan looked at the card. He looked at Cole. Who's your client? He said. I'm not at liberty to say at this stage, Cole said. It was smooth, professionally smooth. Then I'm not able to help you, Nolan said. My vehicles are sold through Marcus Webb. I'll give you his number. Cole accepted the number with the ease of someone who had anticipated this response and had a next move ready. I've actually already spoken with Mr. Webb, he said. He suggested I speak with you directly about any vehicles that weren't being handled through him. Nolan looked at him. Cole held the look with the practiced steadiness of someone who made a living holding looks. Marcus handles everything from the Decker lot, Nolan said. If he's told you to talk to me directly, call me next week and he'll be on the line too. Cole smiled with his mouth. Of course, he said. I'll set that up. He left. Nolan went inside and called Marcus immediately. Did you send someone named Cole to see me? He asked. Marcus was quiet for 2 seconds. No, he said. Cole Automotive Consulting. Said you told him to speak to me directly. I've never spoken to anyone by that name, Marcus said. His voice had changed. The easy authority was still there, but something sharper was underneath it. Nolan, this is Walsh's people finding another route. I know, Nolan said. You need to call Patricia today. Already planning to, Nolan said. He called Patricia. He called Evelyn. He laid out what had happened in the order it had happened, clearly and without dramatizing it. Evelyn listened without interrupting, which was becoming more characteristic of how she listened to him. I'll have Sandra contact Walsh's firm, she said when he'd finished. Do that, he said. And I want it noted in writing that these contacts have happened and that I've refused them. Sandra will handle it, Evelyn said. There was something in her voice now, not anger exactly, but a focused, hard quality, the sound of someone recognizing a specific kind of maneuvering and deciding how to meet it. They're trying to destabilize the evidence before it reaches the court. I know what they're trying, Nolan said. It's not going to work. A pause. No, she said. I don't believe it is. After he hung up, he stood in the shop for a while. The Pontiac was done, had been done for a week. Hargrove had arranged transport, and the car was gone, leaving a gap in the rotation that the next vehicle from the Decker estate would fill. The space on the floor where it had been was clean. He'd ground out a small oil stain and resealed that section of concrete the morning after Hargrove's driver came, because that was what you did when a finished car left and the next one wasn't ready yet. You took care of the space. He thought about Walsh's number and Cole's business card, and the 2 phone calls in 3 days from people who had decided that he was someone whose position could be moved if you found the right lever. He thought about standing at the auction in October with his hand in the air, and the way Evelyn Mercer had looked at him and described what he'd bought as a waste of money. He thought about his father, who had spent 40 years in a shop like this one, on work like this work, and who had never needed anyone else to tell him what it was worth. He picked up the legal pad with Cole's name and the timestamp of the visit and Walsh's call records, clipped it closed, and put it on the shelf next to Patricia's folder. Then he went back to work. Sandra Cho's letter to Walsh's firm went out on a Monday. It was by the account of the 2 junior associates at Hearthstone who drafted it under her direction, one of the more precisely worded pieces of legal correspondence they had encountered in their careers, not threatening in any overt sense, but constructed with the kind of compressed specificity that communicated in the language lawyers used among themselves that the sender had documented everything and was entirely prepared to make that documentation consequential. It named the dates of Walsh's calls. It named Cole and his business card and the specific misrepresentation he had made about Marcus Webb. It noted that all further contact with Nolan Pierce regarding the prototype or any other matter related to the litigation would be treated as potential witness tampering and documented accordingly. Walsh's firm did not respond directly. What they did instead was go quiet, which Sandra told Evelyn was more meaningful than a response would have been. Going quiet meant they had assessed the situation and decided that the approach had not worked and was not going to work, and that continuing it would create more exposure than it would eliminate. Evelyn relayed this to Nolan in a call that was, by that point in their developing pattern of communication, more efficient and less formal than their earlier exchanges. She did not preface it with pleasantries or frame it in corporate language. She said Sandra's letter had done what it needed to do, and the interference appeared to have stopped. Good, Nolan said. He was between tasks. The Corvette was gone, the next Decker estate vehicle, a 1966 Oldsmobile 442 that had been under a third consecutive tarp in the storage shed, was on the lift for initial assessment, and he was waiting for a structural verdict before he committed to the scope of the project. There's something else, Evelyn said. He waited. The trial date has been moved up, 6 weeks from yesterday. He did the math. Kahane's assessment is filed. It's filed. The prototype documentation is in the brief, but our lead attorney wants the car physically present at the courthouse, under subpoena, for the duration of the trial. It's a demonstration of access as much as anything, showing the court that the physical evidence exists and is available. I can arrange transport, Nolan said. You'd be comfortable with that? The car leaving the shop? It's not going anywhere permanently, he said. I'll need climate-controlled transport and a controlled storage environment at the courthouse location. I'll need to specify the handling requirements. We'll meet whatever requirements you give us, she said. He believed her. Not because she was particularly reassuring in the way she said it, but because the trail of behavior he'd observed suggested that when Evelyn Mercer said she would do something, she did it, with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. Whatever her flaws in judgment, and the auction remained the clearest example he had, she was not someone who made commitments casually or failed to honor them once made. Send me the courthouse details and the timeline, he said. I'll make the arrangements. She said she would. Then before she hung up, she said, Nolan. It was the first time she had used his first name without it being a slip or an aside. She said it with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to cross a small threshold and was crossing it without making a production of it. Yes, he said. Thank you for handling the Walsh situation the way you did. A different person might have... She stopped. You had options you didn't use. He considered that. Walsh's offer would have gotten me more money, he said. It would have gotten me more money and cost me everything else. That's not a trade I was interested in. A pause. I know, she said. Then she hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, not quite analyzing the conversation, but letting it settle, the way he let mechanical problems settle sometimes before he reached a conclusion, giving the whole picture time to develop before he acted on any part of it. Then he went back to the 442. The trial, as trials do, generated its own weather system. Nolan was not a participant in it. He was listed as a potential witness, which meant he received briefings from Sandra's team about what he might be asked and what the scope of his testimony would likely be, primarily the process by which he identified the prototype and the basis for his assessment of its authenticity. He understood from those briefings, without anyone stating it directly, that the other side's strategy had shifted since Walsh's approach failed. They could not challenge the prototype's existence. They would instead challenge the chain of custody, arguing that a car purchased at an estate auction by a private individual and held in a machine shed for 2 months had been subjected to conditions that compromised the reliability of the evidence. It was, Nolan acknowledged when Sandra explained it, not an unreasonable argument to make. He also knew it was not going to succeed. because the documentation he had produced was the kind of documentation that happened when someone with a particular standard of practice applied that standard to an unusually significant object. Every photograph time-stamped, every measurement recorded, every component cataloged before it was touched. Kahane's assessment referencing and independently confirming Nolan's findings. "If they call you," Sandra said in one of their prep sessions, "they're going to ask about your qualifications first. They'll argue you're not a credentialed expert." "I'm not a credentialed expert," Nolan said. "I'm a working restorer with 19 years in this specific craft. Those are different things." "They'll say that matters." "My work speaks to what matters," he said. "The documentation is the documentation. Either it's correct or it isn't." Sandra looked at him over the legal pad she'd been making notes on. "You're going to need to say that with more, she searched for the word, accessibility, for a jury." "I can be accessible," he said. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she moved on. In the end, he was not called. The opposing team looked at Kahane's credentials, looked at Nolan's documentation, looked at the physical evidence, and apparently concluded that putting either of them on the stand would not improve their position. The chain of custody argument was made through briefs rather than testimony, and Heartstone's attorneys dismantled it with the comprehensiveness that Sandra had been quietly assembling for weeks. Nolan learned all of this secondhand from Patricia, who had a contact at the courthouse, and from a brief text from Evelyn on the third day of trial that said simply, "Going well." Kahane was excellent. He read it at the workbench over lunch, a sandwich he'd made that morning and forgotten about until noon, and then set his phone down and went back to the 442, which had disclosed its problems in the initial assessment and which had turned out to have them in the expected places and one unexpected one, a previous amateur repair to the driver's side frame rail that was structurally adequate but aesthetically incorrect, meaning whoever had done it had used a non-period weld technique that was visible under the right light, and that Nolan was going to have to address, regardless of what the collector who eventually bought this car knew or cared about the difference. He addressed it over 2 days, working slowly, because slow was the right speed for that kind of repair. The verdict came on a Friday. Heartstone Motors prevailed on the primary count. The federal case was decided in their favor on the question of development priority, with the prototype documentation cited explicitly in the court's finding as material physical evidence confirming the timeline Heartstone had claimed. The opposing party's intellectual property argument was dismissed. The financial exposure that had been accumulating for Heartstone over 3 years, which Sandra had described to Nolan in one of their more candid exchanges, as significant enough to have been a genuine existential concern for the company, was resolved. Nolan heard about it from Patricia, who called at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon. He was finishing the last of the day's work on the 442 when the phone rang. "They won," Patricia said. He set down the tool he was holding. "Completely?" "Primary count, full ruling. The prototype documentation was cited in the decision language." He was quiet for a moment. "Nolan," Patricia said, "that's good news." "I know," he said. "It is." He finished cleaning up and locked the shop and drove home, which was a 15-minute drive on county roads that he had made thousands of times and that he usually made on autopilot, the route so embedded in his muscle memory that he arrived with no specific recollection of the turns. Tonight he drove it consciously, watching the road, the bare November trees, the sky going dark at 5 o'clock, the way it did in this part of autumn. He ate dinner and sat at the kitchen table and thought about his father. Not about the prototype, or the trial, or the money that had moved and would continue to move as the remaining Decker estate vehicles were restored and sold. He thought about a specific afternoon when he was 17 years old and had made a mistake in a restoration job, had sourced an incorrect component and installed it without catching the error, and his father had found it 2 days later during a review inspection. Not an angry finding, just a methodical, unhurried examination that stopped when it found the wrong part and then turned to Nolan with the expression of someone about to say something that mattered. "The car doesn't care about your intentions," his father had said. "The car is what it is. You either did it right or you didn't. That's the whole thing." He had done it right. The prototype, the documentation, the authentication, the careful 17 days of work, he had done it right. Not for Heartstone particularly, and not for the legal outcome, and not even for the money, though all of those things were real. He had done it right because it was a one-of-a-kind object that deserved to be treated as a one-of-a-kind object, because his father had spent 50 years believing that things worth doing were worth doing with that level of attention, and because Nolan had inherited that belief the same way he'd inherited the shop, not by choosing it exactly, but by living inside it long enough that it became inseparable from who he was. He washed his dish and went to bed. Evelyn called Saturday morning. "I wanted to tell you myself," she said. "Patricia already called," he said, "but I appreciate it." A pause, shorter than their earlier pauses. Their silences had evolved over the weeks of working through the agreement and the legal preparation, the way silences between people did when they'd spent enough time in communication that the gaps became comfortable rather than tense. "The board met yesterday evening," she said, after the verdict. The mood was celebratory, which I don't find particularly useful in a boardroom, but it was there. And in the middle of it, I brought up the vocational program. He waited. "There was resistance," she said. It was said plainly, not as a complaint. Two board members who felt that the obligation had been met by the agreement terms and that reaffirming it in the current context was unnecessary. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said the obligation had been met by the agreement terms, and that it was also the right thing to do, and that I was not interested in the distinction between the two." A pause. "That's a slight paraphrase." He said nothing, but something shifted in how he was holding the phone. "The program is moving forward," she said. "I wanted you to know that directly, not through a letter from Sandra." "I appreciate that," he said. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she said. "Her name is Renata Hollis. She runs workforce development programs. She's built 2 vocational training centers in the state over the last decade, and she has a perspective on curriculum and structure that I think would be worth your time. I'd like to set up a meeting." "Set it up," he said. "She's good," Evelyn said. "She's not automotive specific, but she knows how to build a program that actually produces what it says it produces, which is harder than it looks." "Most things are," Nolan said, a pause that had a different quality from the earlier ones, not the pressure silence of negotiation or the recalibration silence of someone processing something unexpected, but the particular quieter quality of a conversation that had arrived somewhere neither party had quite anticipated being. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Go ahead." "The condition, the vocational program. You clearly had leverage in that negotiation, significant leverage. You could have asked for considerably more money and gotten it, and most people in your position would have." "Probably," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about how to answer. He looked out his kitchen window at the back of the property. The bare trees, the early gray light, the corner of the shop roof visible at the edge of the frame. "Because money doesn't fix the actual problem," he said. "The actual problem is that the knowledge is disappearing. The people who know how to do this work correctly, who know what to look for, how to read a vehicle, what matters and what doesn't, they're not being replaced. When my father's generation is gone, and when my generation is gone, a significant part of what they understood is just going to be gone with them, unless someone builds something that keeps it moving forward." He paused. "The prototype was worth what it was worth because someone built it correctly and it survived and someone else knew enough to find it and read it. That's a chain of knowledge. Breaks anywhere in the chain and it's worth nothing. The program is how you keep the chain intact." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this for a long time," she said. "My whole life," he said. "I just never had a negotiation where I could do something about it." So, the meeting with Renata Hollis happened 3 weeks later at Nolan's shop. Renata was 55, broad-shouldered, with the practical energy of someone who had spent decades converting good intentions into functioning institutions, and had learned, through that process, to move quickly through the parts that didn't matter and slowly through the parts that did. She arrived with a notebook and no laptop, which Nolan took as a favorable sign, and she spent the first 20 minutes walking through the shop looking at everything without commenting, which was an even more favorable sign. She had done her homework. She knew the shop's history. Ray Pierce, the 40 years of accumulated practice, the specific tradition of restoration work that had been conducted here. She had read Marcus Webb's columns on the Decker estate restorations, which Marcus had eventually written for a collector's journal, and which had been more widely read than he'd anticipated. She had spoken with 2 vocational educators in the state before coming, preparing her questions. "Tell me what you actually want this program to produce," she said when they sat down at the folding table. "Mechanics who can read a vehicle the way a historian reads a primary source," Nolan said, "who understand what they're looking at, not just mechanically, but historically. Who know why something is built the way it's built, what it means in context, how to assess authenticity and condition with the same rigor you'd apply to any significant object." Renata wrote, "That's not a basic skills program," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." "It's also not a 3-month certificate course," she said. "No, it's a 2-year curriculum minimum, and even that requires a foundation of mechanical skills that most students will need to develop either before or concurrent with the specialized training." She looked up from the notebook. "You've thought about the curriculum?" "I've been thinking about it for a long time," he said. "I just never had a structure to build it in." "Do you want to be involved in the curriculum development?" He had expected this question and had not fully resolved it. Teaching was not something he had done in any formal sense. The closest he'd come was the 4 months with Tyler, the part-time assistant, which had not been a successful experience for either of them. Though in retrospect, Nolan acknowledged, the failure had been as much about the mismatch between Tyler's pace and the work's requirements as about any fundamental inability to transmit knowledge. "I want to be involved in the design," he said. "Whether I'm the right person to teach it, I'm less certain." "You know people who could," Renata said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. The Cincinnati restorer, Douglas, a woman in Kentucky who specialized in interior restoration and had a reputation that the serious collector community had been quietly aware of for years. Marcus himself, who would not work on cars but whose knowledge of their history and significance was irreplaceable. A handful of others. "Can you get me a list?" Renata said. "I can get you a list," he said. She wrote for another minute. Then she looked up. "Ms. Mercer has committed real money to this," she said. "More than the floor in the agreement. She came to me with a figure that was approximately 40% above the contractual minimum. She wanted me to know that before I came to see you." Nolan took that in. He had not known the specific number, but was not entirely surprised by the direction. "She said something else," Renata continued, with the careful tone of someone relaying information they had been told they could relay. "She said the program should be named for your father, if you were agreeable." The shop was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Ridgeline Road, and the sound of it faded into the distance. Nolan looked at the workbench, at the pegboard wall with its tools in their places, at the yellow legal pads, at the binders and manuals and catalogs that represented a lifetime of accumulated specific knowledge that had been passed to him in this space, at this bench, by a man who had believed completely in the value of knowing things correctly. "I'll think about it," he said. Renata did not push it. She asked 3 more practical questions and wrote the answers and then closed her notebook. "I can have a program framework to you in 6 weeks, she said. "Preliminary, not final, but enough to react to." "That's fine," he said. She stood and offered her hand. He shook it. She looked around the shop one more time. "My grandfather was a machinist," she said. "Different trade. But I recognize this kind of shop." "What do you recognize about it?" he asked. She thought about it. "That it's a place where the work is the point," she said. "Not the product. The work." He nodded. She left. He stood in the empty shop for a while. December came and the light shortened and the cold arrived with the specific authority of a Midwestern winter deciding to be itself. The 442 was done and gone, a buyer from Illinois found through Marcus, who had driven 4 hours to look at it and agreed to the price in the parking lot before he'd been inside the shop for 10 minutes, which was the kind of transaction Nolan found both gratifying and faintly suspicious, before accepting it as genuine. He was 7 vehicles into the Decker lot now. 10 remaining, including the prototype, which he was working on in the evenings and on weekend mornings. Not rushing it, building the documentation alongside the restoration, treating it with the care it required. Evelyn came to the shop one afternoon in mid-December, unannounced. It was the first time she had come without an appointment or a purpose, and she stood in the doorway in a good coat over work clothes, which was an outfit that didn't quite go together in the way her usual professional presentation went together, and which Nolan read, without making anything of it, as someone who had left the office in the middle of the day and not entirely planned ahead. "I was in the area," she said. Then, with the slight self-deprecation of someone aware of how that sounded, "I was not in the area. I wanted to see how the prototype was coming." "It's in the shed," he said. "Come look." He led her out. He pulled back the tarp. She looked at the car, which had changed significantly since her last visit. The surface corrosion addressed on the passenger side, the hood removed and currently on a padded stand for separate work, the interior documented and 3 components carefully extracted for separate cleaning and examination. "It's getting there," she said. "Slowly," he said. She looked at the mounting brackets on the firewall, which were visible now with the hood off and the engine bay accessible. "Those are what Kahane referenced in his testimony," she said. "Yes." She leaned in and looked at them. She was not a mechanical person, he had understood from early on, in the sense of someone with formed technical intuitions about vehicles, but she had a genuine intellectual curiosity that had become more visible as their interactions had multiplied. She asked good questions, and she listened to the answers without performing comprehension. "They built this car for a specific test purpose," she said. "Right. And then it ended up in a salvage lot in rural Indiana for 30 years. Apparently," she straightened up. "How does that happen?" "Things get lost," he said. "Companies change direction, programs get canceled, records get transferred and files get misfiled, and people retire and take their institutional knowledge with them. And the physical objects that corresponded to that knowledge get left behind because nobody's around anymore to recognize what they are." He looked at the car. "It happens more than you'd think." She stood there for a moment. "My father's Challenger," she said, then stopped. He waited. "I've been thinking about that car since I mentioned it here," she said, "which I didn't expect. I haven't thought about it in, 15 years, maybe longer." She paused. "He sold the last piece of it the year I started college, a set of cylinder heads to someone at a swap meet. I remember watching him take the money." Nolan said nothing. "He needed it," she said. "That's not a complaint. He needed the money, and the car gave it to him, and that was the right decision under the circumstances." She looked at the prototype. "But I remember his face when the man drove away with the heads. He watched until the truck was gone." She stopped. The storage shed was quiet. Cold, the kind of cold that settled in metal buildings in December, and the afternoon light coming through the open face was the low, flat light of a short day. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said. "People tell me things in here," Nolan said. "It's the shop. It has that effect." She looked at him with a quick, genuine expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one, the kind of involuntary expression that happened when something landed unexpectedly. "Maybe," she said. They walked back inside. He offered coffee, which surprised her. He could tell by the beat she took before accepting. And he made it on the old drip machine his father had bought in the early 90s, and that Nolan had repaired 3 times and had no intention of replacing. She sat on the stool at the end of the workbench and wrapped both hands around the cup. "Renata sent me the preliminary framework," she said, "the program structure." "She sent it to me too," he said, "last week." "What did you think?" He thought about it. "The first-year curriculum is solid. The second year needs more time on period-specific materials, not just general restoration technique, but the specific knowledge base that makes the difference between competent work and historically accurate work. Those are different things. Can you give her that?" "I sent her 12 pages of notes," he said. She almost smiled. "Of course you did." He drank his coffee. "The name," she said, "the Ray Pierce Restoration Program. Have you thought about it?" He had thought about it every day since Renata had mentioned it. He had thought about it the way he thought about the things that mattered, without forcing it, without reaching for a conclusion before one was ready, letting the whole shape of it develop. "Yes," he said. "And?" "It's the right name," he said. She nodded. She looked at her coffee, then she looked up. "What was he like?" she asked. "Your father." It was a simple question, and also not a simple question, and Nolan held it for a moment before he answered. "Precise," he said. "Patient with the work and less patient with most everything else." He had very strong opinions about how things should be done, and almost no interest in whether other people agreed with those opinions. He paused. He was not easy to work for. He was also the best mechanic I've ever known, including people with 2 or 3 times his formal training. Did he know that? How good he was? Nolan thought about it. He knew the work was good, he said. Whether he knew it was exceptional, I think he thought exceptional was beside the point. He thought you either did it right or you didn't, and if you did it right, the rest took care of itself. She looked at him for a moment. You believe that too, she said. It was an observation, not a question. He acknowledged it with the slight nod of someone accepting an accurate characterization of themselves. It worked out, he said. Not smoothly, not without cost, but it worked out. She held that. Outside, the December wind moved through the trees along the property line, bare branches against a sky that had gone the color of old aluminum, and the sound of it came under the eaves of the shop with the particular low note of a cold afternoon running out of light. I owe you an apology, she said. It came out with the clean directness of someone who had decided on a thing and was doing it without preamble. For the auction, what I said. He looked at her. It wasn't just wrong, she said. It was dismissive. And I said it loudly and publicly and without knowing what I was talking about, which is a particular kind of wrong that I usually hold myself to a higher standard about. She paused. I wanted to say that plainly. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Apology accepted, he said. It was said simply, with no residue of the auction in his voice, because there genuinely was no residue. He had not carried what she'd said as an injury, because what she'd said had been irrelevant to the reality of what he'd known about those vehicles. She nodded once. She finished her coffee and set the cup down. I should let you get back to work, she said. I've got a couple more hours, he said, before the light goes. She stood and buttoned her coat. At the door she paused and looked back at the shop, at all of it, the whole working space, in the way that she had looked at it the first time, taking it in. This is a good place, she said. It is, he said. She left. He listened to her car on the gravel, and then the sound fading on Ridgeline Road, and then the shop was quiet in the particular way it was always quiet when the day was moving toward done. He washed the 2 cups. He put them back where they went. He went out to the shed and worked on the prototype for another hour in the cold and the failing light, until it was too dark to see correctly, and he put his tools down and covered the car and stood there for a minute in the dark before he went inside. January came in hard that year, the kind of cold that settled into the bones of old buildings and made the concrete floor of the shop feel like it was radiating something downward rather than upward, drawing heat out through the soles of your boots, no matter how good they were. Nolan had put in a second propane heater the previous winter after the original wall-mounted unit started cycling inefficiently, and even with both running, the shop held at about 58 degrees on the coldest mornings, which was cold enough to require a second layer under the canvas jacket and warm enough to work in if you kept moving. He kept moving. The prototype was his primary project now. The other Decker estate vehicles were cycling through. The 442 had gone, a 1964 Pontiac GTO was on the lift, and 3 weeks from completion, 2 more were waiting in the shed. But the prototype occupied the center of his attention in the way that certain projects did. Not because they demanded the most urgent attention, but because they carried the most weight. You felt that weight while you were working on other things. It was always there, at the edge of your awareness, pulling slightly. He had been working on it since November in the long-form way that serious restoration required. Not daily in the intensive sprint sense, but consistently, building knowledge before he built anything else. He had opened it fully now. The engine was on the stand. The body was stripped to bare metal on the driver's side, where the corrosion had gone deeper than the passenger side and required more intervention. The interior components that had survived were cataloged and on padded shelving along the shed wall. The firewall, with its development-era mounting brackets and routing channels, had been photographed from 47 angles and documented in a section of the legal pad that had grown to 12 pages of dense technical notation. He worked in the evenings, mostly. The days went to the paying projects. The GTO, the growing queue of outside work that had been building since the Decker estate cars had circulated through the collector community and established a reputation that brought inquiries at a pace he was still figuring out how to manage. The evenings went to the prototype, 2 or 3 hours in the cold shed with good light and silence and the particular focused patience that this car required. Marcus came by one evening in mid-January, unexpected, which was becoming more characteristic of him as the months had accumulated and their acquaintance had evolved past the formality of arranged meetings. He brought a thermos of coffee, which had also become characteristic, and he sat on the overturned crate and watched Nolan work for 20 minutes before saying anything. "How much longer?" Marcus said. 3 months, Nolan said. "Maybe 4. Marcus looked at the stripped driver's side body panel, at the bare metal under the shop light. "You're not rushing it." "No." "The collectors who've been asking," Marcus started. "I know about the collectors who've been asking," Nolan said. He was working on a section of the rocker panel, carefully, with the particular concentration that made unnecessary speech feel like interference. "Tell them 3 months. Marcus poured coffee into the thermos cap and set it on the crate next to where Nolan could reach it. "There's a man from the Detroit Foundation, Louis Garfield. He's called me twice in the last month. About the prototype? About documentation access. He wants to include it in a permanent archive project they're running, development-era vehicles from that period. Physical access to the car, high-resolution documentation, the whole treatment." Nolan worked for another moment. "After it's done," he said, "he'll want to be in contact with you." "After it's done," Nolan said again. Marcus accepted this. He drank his coffee. Outside, the January wind moved across the corrugated roof with a low metallic sound, the kind of sound that old buildings made in cold months, not alarming, just the structure speaking to the weather. "The program framework," Marcus said. "Renata sent me the revised curriculum." Nolan had received it too. Renata's second draft had incorporated his 12 pages of notes and had become something considerably more substantial than her first version. A 2-year structure with a genuine first principles approach to the technical history, period-specific material requirements, and what Nolan had privately thought of as the reading component. The systematic training of the eye and the hand to recognize authenticity, which was the hardest thing to teach because it was not a list of facts, but a developed sense, built through accumulated exposure and corrected observation. "What did you think of it?" Nolan asked. "I think it's better than anything I've seen in this field," Marcus said. "And I've seen everything in this field." Nolan nodded. He kept working. "She wants you to teach the historical context module," Marcus said. She was direct about it. Said she could find people with the technical credentials, but the specific combination of technical and historical understanding, she said you were the only person she'd talked to who held both with equal depth. Nolan didn't answer immediately. "She's right," Marcus said. "I know she's right," Nolan said. "I'm thinking about how to do it without it interfering with the shop work." "It'll interfere some," Marcus said. "I know that too." Marcus looked at the car, at the bare metal, the removed components on the padded shelving, the organized documentation. "Your father would have loved this," he said. Not sentimentally, just as a statement of fact. "Yes," Nolan said. "He would have driven everyone insane with his opinions about the correct approach, and then been right about most of them." Marcus made the sound that was his version of a laugh. He finished his coffee, rinsed the thermos cap with the small bottle of water he carried, dried it, and stood up. 3 months, he said. 3 months, Nolan confirmed. Marcus left. Nolan worked for another hour and a half in the cold and the silence until the section of rocker panel he was addressing was correct, not merely adequate correct. And then he covered the car and went inside. The Ray Pierce Restoration Program opened in March. Not in a grand sense. The facility was still being built out. A leased space in a commercial district on the west side of Millhaven that Renata had identified and Heartstone had funded. A former machine shop with good bones and the kind of square footage that would work for a working classroom environment. The opening in March was the first cohort of students, 8 of them, gathered in a space that still had paint tarps on half the walls and folding tables serving as workbenches, while the permanent infrastructure was installed around them. Nolan taught the first session. He had prepared for it the way he prepared for anything that required precision, thoroughly, in advance, without shortcuts. And he had also been more nervous about it than he expected, which he had not admitted to anyone except possibly Marcus, and even then only by implication. Teaching was different from doing. He knew that abstractly, and he was learning it concretely in the 48 hours before the first session when he kept revising his notes and then recognizing that notes were not really the point and setting them aside. The 8 students ranged from 19 to 53. 2 women, 6 men. One of them, a young man named Deshaun, who was 22 and had spent 2 years doing basic bodywork at a collision shop, had a quality of attention that Nolan recognized in the first 10 minutes. The specific focus of someone who was in the right room and knew it. The 53-year-old, a woman named Grace, who had spent 20 years as a machinist before a repetitive stress injury changed her work situation, asked the best question of the first session, which was, "How do you know when you know enough to start?" Nolan had thought about that question for a moment. "You don't," he said. "You start with what you know and you let the car tell you what else you need to learn. The car is always ahead of you. That's not a problem to solve. That's the condition of the work." Grace had written that down. He had watched her write it and felt something he didn't have a ready word for, something adjacent to the feeling of a correctly timed engine running cleanly under load, which was not a sentimental comparison, but was the most accurate one he had. After the session, Renata caught him at the door. "How do you think it went?" she asked. "Better than I expected," he said. "Worse than it will." She considered that. "That's an honest answer." "I'm not capable of the other kind," he said. She smiled, a real one, the kind she produced rarely enough that it registered when it happened. "Deshaun is going to be significant," she said. "I know," Nolan said. He drove back to the shop and worked until 8 o'clock on the GTO, which was in its final week, and then he drove home and sat at the kitchen table and wrote 4 pages of notes about what he wanted to do differently in the second session. Spring came the way springs did in that part of Indiana, reluctantly, in fits, with cold snaps in April that felt like the season second-guessing itself. But by May, the light was back, and the days had length, and the shop was warm enough without the propane heaters by 9 in the morning. The prototype was on the floor, not on the lift, not in the shed, on the floor of the main shop, in the morning light, finished. Or as close to finished as Nolan's standard allowed, which meant he had examined it 3 times in the previous week from every angle and found each time the same 3 things he wanted to address further and had addressed, and had then found 2 new things on the subsequent examination and had addressed those, and now stood in the shop looking at it with the considered eye of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that there was a moment when you had to accept that the car was what it could be, given what it had been and what had happened to it, and that this was that moment. It was not perfect. That was not the right word for it, and was never the right word for a car that had been through what this one had been through. What it was correct. Structurally honest. Every decision made in the restoration documented and defensible. Every component either original or correctly sourced with correct provenance. The development era modifications preserved and clearly identified rather than hidden or removed. The color was original, a factory blue-gray that had required 3 weeks of research to correctly identify and formulate. Working with a paint specialist Nolan had used twice before, a man named Archie, who was 70 and had mixed custom colors for 40 years, and who had looked at Nolan's documentation and then looked at the faded traces in a protected corner of the door jamb and spent 2 days doing something that Nolan respected enough not to interrupt. Marcus came on a Tuesday morning in May with Douglas Ferentz from Cincinnati, who had driven up for the occasion with the quiet deliberateness of someone who understood that certain things were worth a 6-hour round trip, and Lewis Garfield from the Detroit Foundation, who had flown in the previous evening and was staying at the airport hotel, and who arrived in a rental car at 9:15 with the contained excitement of a man who had been waiting for this for months. Garfield was 60, compact, with close-cut gray hair and the careful movements of someone accustomed to being around objects that rewarded care. He walked around the car twice without speaking. He crouched at the front and at the rear. He stood at the driver's side and looked at the firewall through the open door for a long time. "The mounting brackets," he said. He was not asking. "Original," Nolan said. "Preserved intact. I worked around them." Garfield looked at Nolan. "You understand what this car is," he said. Again, not a question. "I do," Nolan said. Most people who would have found it wouldn't have. I know. Garfield was quiet for another moment. Then, I want to discuss the archive project when you have time. The documentation you've produced it's the kind of work we build archives around, Mr. Pierce. The Foundation would like to make it a centerpiece. I'm open to that conversation, Nolan said. Douglas had moved to the rear of the car and was looking at the tail section with the focused expression of someone reading fine print. The bodywork on the driver's side, he said, where the corrosion had gone deep. Yes. I can't see it. That's the idea, Nolan said. Douglas stood and looked at the whole car. He had the self-contained quality of someone not given to excessive expression, but something in his face shifted as he looked at it. A small, genuine movement that said more than commentary would have. Extraordinary work, he said. The same words he had used for the Chevelle, and they landed the same way, with the weight of someone who did not use them as filler. Marcus stood back from all of it, near the workbench, and watched. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face had the expression Nolan had come to associate with him in moments of genuine feeling. A slight stillness, a quality of attention that was different from his usual alertness. When Garfield and Douglas had moved outside to take calls and discuss logistics, Marcus came forward and stood next to Nolan at the car. Ray would have wanted to see this, he said. He would have found something wrong with the paint formulation, Nolan said. Marcus produced his version of a laugh. Probably. He looked at the car for a long moment. What's your plan for it? It stays, Nolan said. Marcus looked at him. Garfield is going to want it for the Foundation archive eventually. Reproductions and documentation can go to the archive, Nolan said. The car stays here. You're not going to sell it. No. Marcus absorbed this. There are buyers who would... I know there are buyers, Nolan said. It's not for sale. He looked at the car. Some things are worth more kept than sold. My father knew that. He just didn't always have the option. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, he knew what he was doing with you, teaching you what he taught you. Nolan didn't say anything. Not everyone who knows things understands how to pass them on, Marcus said. That's a separate skill. He had both. Nolan looked at the car for a while longer. Then he picked up his shop rag and went to the workbench because the GTO's buyer was coming on Thursday, and there was a fuel line fitting he wanted to inspect one more time before delivery. What? Evelyn came in June. She called first, which she had stopped doing for a while and had started doing again. He was not sure exactly when the transition had happened, but it had, and the calling ahead felt less like scheduling and more like courtesy between people who had established enough familiarity that the showing up unannounced was a privilege to be used selectively rather than a right. She arrived at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, in the same charcoal blazer over dark jeans she'd been wearing the first time she came to the shop, which might have been coincidence and might have been something else. He had noticed it before he decided not to make anything of it, and then had made something of it anyway, in a private, offhand way, in the part of his mind that noticed things without requiring them to be discussed. The prototype was on the floor. It had been on the floor for 6 weeks, which was longer than finished cars usually stayed before they were either sold or moved to storage. He had not moved it. She walked to it without being directed and stood looking at it for a long time. This is what it looked like, she said, under everything. More or less, he said. There are concessions to what it went through. I didn't try to make it look like it rolled out of the development facility in 1969. That would have been dishonest. But this is what it was. Close enough, he said. As close as I can get. She walked slowly around the car, the way she had started to walk around cars, with attention, with the specific quality of someone who had spent enough time around this work to have developed a genuine eye, even if it was still forming. She had come to the shop 7 times since December. Each time she had looked at whatever was on the floor with more informed attention than the previous time. He had noticed this without commenting on it, because commenting on it would have changed it, and he preferred to let it develop at its own pace. She stopped at the driver's side and looked at the firewall through the window. The brackets, she said. Yes. They're going to be in the Foundation archive. Documentation of them will be, he said. High-resolution photographs, dimensional records, the full written analysis. Garfield's team was here last week. She nodded. She straightened and looked at the whole car from the driver's side. The program, she said. Renata told me the second cohort is oversubscribed. She has a waiting list. 34 applications for 12 spots, Nolan said. That's faster than she expected. It's faster than I expected, he said. He set down the wrench he'd been carrying. He'd been doing a final check on the GTO's replacement engine for a client, interrupted by her arrival, and leaned against the workbench. Deshawn presented his first full assessment last week. First-year student, 6 months in. The assessment was better than work I've seen from people with 5 years of experience. Because of the program? Because he was going to be exceptional regardless, Nolan said. The program gave him the framework to direct it. That's what a good program does. It doesn't create ability. It gives ability somewhere to go. Evelyn looked at him. Is that what your father did for you? He thought about it honestly. He gave me the work and the standards and the space to fail at them until I got them right, he said. Whether that's teaching or just proximity to expertise, I'm not sure there's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. The board review for the program funding is in August, she said. There are 2 members who are still looking for an exit ramp. They view it as an obligation that was met under pressure rather than a strategic commitment. I know, he said. He'd been told as much by Renata, who had her own sources inside Hearthstone. I'm going to present the program as a strategic commitment, Evelyn said. Not because of the agreement terms, because it's correct. She paused. I wanted you to know that before the review. He looked at her. She was looking at the prototype, not at him, but with the quality of attention that was directed at him rather than at the car. Thank you, he said. She looked at him then. The appraisers I sent to the Decker estate, she said. I let 2 of them go. Not for the Decker assessment specifically. There were other situations where the same pattern showed up. Surface assessment stated as conclusive analysis. He said nothing. I'm not telling you to explain myself, she said. I'm telling you because you were the one who showed me the gap between the 2 things, and you should know what I did with that. He considered that. There was something in it that was not quite an apology. She had already made that, and not quite a report. It was something closer to an accounting, the kind you gave to someone you had decided to hold yourself accountable to. Those appraisers land on their feet, he said. It was not a question. They'll be fine, she said. He nodded. She looked at the prototype one more time. You're keeping it, she said. Yes. Even with what Garfield would pay. Even with that. She looked at him with a direct, undecorated attention that he had become familiar with, and that still, occasionally, had a quality of surprise to it, as if she kept arriving at what he was and finding it consistent, and consistency was not something she had learned to expect without noticing it. My father would have understood that, she said. I think he would have, Nolan said. She stayed another 40 minutes. They talked about the program, about the second cohort's progress, about Renata's plan to bring in Douglas Ference for a 3-day intensive on engine assessment in the fall. They talked about Louis Garfield's archive project and the question of whether development-era vehicles from other estates might be in the Foundation's acquisition pipeline. They talked in the easy, informative way of 2 people who had accumulated enough shared context to make conversation efficient without making it impersonal. When she left, she shook his hand at the door. Not the formal handshake of their first meeting, but the handshake of people who had been through something together and come out on the other side of it with something they hadn't gone in with. He couldn't have named exactly what that something was. He also didn't need to name it. He watched her car on the gravel, and then the road, and then gone. August arrived and the board reviewed the program, and the funding was continued, affirmed as a strategic commitment in the formal language of the resolution, with an increased allocation for the 3rd year that reflected the oversubscription and the early outcomes from the first cohort. Nolan heard about it from Renata, who called at 7 in the morning with an energy in her voice that she usually kept more compressed. It's official, she said, not an exit ramp in sight. Good, he said. She was very direct in there, Renata said. I have a contact who was in the room. She made the case on its own merits, and she made it well. I expected she would, Nolan said. He drove to the program facility that afternoon. The second cohort was in the middle of a session, and he stood in the doorway for a few minutes and watched without interrupting. 12 people around 2 vehicles, Deshawn, who had been asked to assist with the second cohort's practical sessions, an arrangement that had been Nolan's suggestion and Renata's design, demonstrating a point about reading surface corrosion patterns to a woman who was leaning in with the specific quality of someone absorbing something they were going to use. He watched that for a while. There was something in it that was not easy to describe and that he was not going to try to describe because the attempt would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. What he felt standing in that doorway was not pride exactly, and not satisfaction in the way satisfaction was usually meant. It was something more like recognition, the feeling of seeing something real in the process of becoming more real, of watching knowledge move from one set of hands to another, which was the only way it ever survived. His father had stood in the doorway of the shop on Ridgeline Road and watched Nolan work, early on, when Nolan was making the mistakes that had to be made before the corrections could be learned. He had stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and his particular quality of patient attention and had waited until the right moment to speak, which was not always when Nolan expected him to speak and was always exactly when it needed to happen. Nolan had not fully understood, at 17 or 22 or even 30, what his father was doing when he stood in that doorway. He understood it now. He left without interrupting the session. He drove back to the shop on Ridgeline Road and went in through the side door, the way he always did, and stood for a moment in the middle of the main floor. The prototype was in its place, against the far wall, not on the lift and not under a tarp. Just sitting there in the ordinary light of a working shop, the way finished cars sat when they were staying, present, available, not on their way anywhere. He had positioned it where the afternoon light hit it correctly, which was a choice he'd made without overthinking it, in the same way he made all the choices about the space, instinctively, based on accumulated knowledge of what worked and what didn't, and why. He walked to the workbench and sat on the stool and looked at it. He thought about the auction in October, the cold morning, the gravel lot, the crowd standing back from 17 rusted vehicles with a unanimous body language of people who had already decided. He thought about what he had known in that moment that no one else in that yard knew, and about where that knowledge had come from, and about everything that the knowing had set in motion. He thought about his father at 81 years old, hands that had gotten too stiff for close work, sitting in the one comfortable chair in the shop and watching Nolan work on a GTO that a Nashville collector had brought in, speaking only when something required speaking, which was less and less often as the years went on, and Nolan's hands accumulated their own authority. And looking at the work with the expression of someone who understood completely what they were seeing and was content to watch it happen. Not proud, exactly. Something older than pride. The look of someone recognizing what they had passed forward and seeing that it had taken. Nolan had understood that look then, but he understood it differently now. He thought about Deshawn in the facility doorway, demonstrating something to someone who was leaning in to learn it. He thought about Grace writing down his answer to her question in the first session, the first thing that had been worth writing down, the pen moving across the paper with the care of someone who understood that some things needed to be kept. He thought about Evelyn standing in this shop in December light, holding a coffee cup she hadn't expected to be offered, telling him about a Dodge Challenger her father had sold in pieces and never recovered, the way memory operated in people, surfacing in new contexts, showing you things about the past that you hadn't known were still there. He thought about Marcus on an overturned crate in the shed, the cold, the thermos, the way the man looked at a finished vehicle with the eyes of someone who had been looking at finished vehicles his whole professional life and had not once allowed that familiarity to become routine. He thought about Patricia's 12 pages of legal notes, red ink in the margins, her voice at 7 in the evening telling him the penalty language needed teeth, and the way she had said his first name in the conversation about Walsh, the tonal shift that meant something mattered. He thought about all of it as a single continuous thing, which it was. Not a sequence of transactions or a series of separate events, but a single continuous thing, knowledge moving through time from hand to hand, from eye to eye, accumulating and transmitting and surviving the gaps between generations through the specific, unglamorous, daily work of paying attention and doing things correctly, and refusing to accept that the surface was the whole story. His father had understood that, had built his whole life around that understanding, in a shop on a county road in Indiana, with no audience and no recognition and no outcome he could have predicted. Just the work and the standards and the belief that the work mattered because it was done correctly, and because correct things had a way of persisting that incorrect things didn't. The prototype against the wall was evidence of that. So was Deshawn in the program facility. So was the name on the sign that Renata had ordered and that would go up in the next week. The Ray Pierce Restoration Program. In plain black letters on white, the same style as the sign outside on Ridgeline Road, because Renata had asked and Nolan had shown her and she had understood immediately that plain was correct. He sat on the stool for a while longer. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow, diagonal way it moved in summer, crossing the concrete and touching the base of the prototype and then moving on. Outside, a truck passed on the road, and the sound of it faded into the ordinary rural quiet of late afternoon. Insects, wind in the trees, the distant machinery of neighboring farms conducting their summer work. There were 8 vehicles left from the Decker estate. One of them was a 1969 Pontiac Firebird that the database research suggested might be a Ram Air 4 variant, which, if confirmed, would be a significant find, the kind of discovery that the first assessment of the lot had not identified because it required pulling the numbers and knowing exactly what numbers to pull. He would start the formal assessment next week. There was the 3rd cohort application process opening in September, and a curriculum question Renata had sent him that he had not yet answered about the appropriate depth of chemical treatment training in the first year versus the second. There was the engine rebuild on a '68 Camaro that had come in from a private client in Tennessee. Not a Decker vehicle, just regular work, the kind that kept the lights on and the mortgage paid and the shop running, which was not glamorous and was entirely necessary and was, in its own right, work that required doing correctly. There was all of that, and it was enough, and it was not finished, and it was not supposed to be finished. That was not how this kind of work operated. It did not arrive at a destination and stop. It moved forward through the hands that learned it, and the hands that taught it, and the hands that were forming right now in a leased space on the west side of Mill Haven, making their first careful attempts at reading what a vehicle was trying to say. He stood up from the stool. He put on his work gloves. He went to the lift and brought down the Firebird documentation he'd started the previous week and spread the pages on the workbench under the light. He picked up his pencil and went to work. Outside, the afternoon continued on its ordinary terms. The light, the road, the sound of the county going about its business. Inside the shop on Ridgeline Road, in the accumulated quiet of 40 years of serious work, a man who had learned to read the language of machines was doing what he had always done, paying attention to what was actually there, beneath the surface of things, where the real story lived.